The supply stop at Caldwell's Creek wasn't on Gideon Vance's original route. He'd planned to ride straight through to Harlan County, pick up the herd he'd agreed to drive north, and be done with it before the first hard frost bit into the ground. But his rifle had thrown its rear sight somewhere between the Ochre Flats and the Scrub Hills east of the creek, and without a functioning long gun, a man driving cattle through open country was asking for trouble he couldn't afford. So he turned his horse west. The trading post sat at the junction of two dirt roads that barely deserved the name. It was the kind of place that existed because there was nowhere else for 50 miles in any direction. A low, weathered building that looked like it had been built by someone who knew just enough about carpentry to get the job done, and not one thing more. The sign above the door read Caldwell Supply in faded black letters, and someone had added in much newer paint beneath it, Dry Goods Hardware Ammunition. There were two horses hitched at the rail out front. Neither of them looked particularly healthy. Gideon tied his own horse, a big roan gelding named Calder, to the far end of the rail and went inside. The smell hit him first. That particular smell of frontier trading posts everywhere, sawdust, gun oil, dried tobacco, and underneath it all something sour that might have been spoiled meat, or might have been the building itself beginning to rot. A single oil lamp hung from the ceiling beam, turned low. Shelves lined the walls, reasonably stocked. A counter ran along the back wall, and behind it, nobody stood. Gideon waited. He looked over the rifles hung on the back wall rack. He checked the prices chalked on a small board near the window. He waited some more. "Hello?" he called. Nothing. He drummed his fingers on the counter once. A cat appeared from somewhere in the back, regarded him with the indifference that cats reserve specifically for people who need something, and disappeared again. Gideon moved around the counter's end and pushed through the door to the back room. What he found stopped him completely. The shopkeeper, a man in his 60s, heavy-set, wearing a canvas apron, lay on his back near an overturned stool. He'd been dead for somewhere between 12 and 24 hours, Gideon figured. The cause wasn't difficult to determine. Someone had hit him hard across the back of the head, and from the angle he'd fallen, he hadn't seen it coming. His face carried the particular stillness of a man who'd been surprised right out of the world. Gideon stood there for a moment, just looking. He'd seen dead men before. The frontier didn't spare you from that. But there was something about this one. The apron, the age of the man, the way his hands were still partially raised, as if he'd tried to protect something right at the end, that made Gideon's chest go tight. He heard it then. It was barely a sound at all, more like a shift in the silence, a faint scraping, a breath that came out wrong. It came from the far corner of the back room behind a stack of crates that reached chest height. Gideon drew his pistol before he moved. He went around the crates carefully, keeping his back to the wall, and found the storage alcove wedged in between the rear of the building and the crate stack. She was there. His first thought, absurdly, was that she was very young. His second thought was that she'd been tied there for a long time. Her wrists were bound behind her with coarse rope, looped through a large iron ring bolted to the wall, and her ankles were lashed together with what looked like a bridle strap. She'd slumped sideways against the wall, and her hair, dark, matted, hanging across her face, made it hard to see anything clearly. Gideon holstered his pistol and went to one knee beside her. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low. "Can you hear me?" Her head moved, slowly, like it cost her something. The hair shifted away from her face, and he saw it. A jaw that was badly swollen on the left side, a split at the corner of her mouth that had dried to a dark crust, one eye that was nearly swollen shut, and beneath the torn collar of her shirt, disappearing into the fabric, the edge of something burned into her skin. He could only see part of it, but he knew what shape it made. 2 crossing thorns. The mark of the blackthorn outfit. He'd seen that mark on a fence post 12 years ago, at the edge of his father's property, the morning after they'd burned the barn and killed 2 of the farmhands, and left his father sitting in the dirt holding a notice that told him he had 3 days to sign over the deed, or they'd come back for the house. His father had signed. Gideon took his knife from his belt and cut the rope at her wrists first, then the strap at her ankles. Her arms dropped and she made a sound that was almost a gasp, like the return of circulation hurt worse than the binding had. He caught her before she could fall further and supported her weight against his arm. "Easy," he said. "I've got you." Her good eye opened. It was a dark gray color, like river water in winter, and it was looking at him with an expression he recognized. Not gratitude, not relief, but the hard, careful assessment of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust a stranger just because they were cutting you loose. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice came out rough and barely there, like gravel dragged over rock. "Name's Gideon Vance. I stopped to buy a rifle." He kept his voice even. "There's a dead man in the other room." "I know." She blinked slowly. "His name was Emmett Caldwell. He was trying to get me out when they came back." "How long have you been here?" She seemed to consider the question like it required actual calculation. 3 days, maybe. I lost track of the dark and the light." 3 days. No water, by the look of her lips. Whatever food she might have had was long gone. "Can you stand?" "I don't know yet." He respected that answer more than he would have respected a yes. It took her 2 attempts to get upright, and she did most of it herself, which told him something. She was hurt. Badly, he suspected, in ways he couldn't see, but she had reserves in her that weren't touched yet. She stood with one hand braced against the wall and took a slow breath, and when she looked at him again, the assessment in her face had shifted slightly. Not trust, but a provisional judgment that he probably wasn't the worst option she had. "There are 3 men," she said. "They went to get more rope and a wagon. They'll be back by evening." Gideon looked toward the front of the building. Through the small window beside the shelves, the light outside was already starting to lean toward afternoon. "Then we need to move," he said. Her name was Rowan Hale, and she told him that much and nothing more for the first 2 hours of riding. She sat behind him on Calder because she had no horse of her own, and the fact that she kept herself upright through sheer stubbornness for the entire ride was something Gideon filed away without comment. He pushed Calder hard going east, then cut south toward the valley road that would take them away from the supply post and away from the main routes the Blackthorn men would know to check. The roan was a good horse, steady and deep-chested, and he carried double without complaint. They made Hector's Crossing by late afternoon, a scatter of buildings along a dry creek bed that was barely a settlement but had a rooming house that took in travelers without asking too many questions, which was all Gideon needed right now. He helped Rowan down from the horse, and she stood in the dust of the yard with her arms slightly away from her sides, like she was balancing on something unsteady. "I can walk," she said, before he offered. "I know," he said. He got her a room. He got her water and food from the rooming house kitchen. Cold beans and cornbread, nothing remarkable. And he left it on the table inside the door and stepped back out to the hallway to give her space. He wasn't sure what else to do. He'd helped people before, in the uncomplicated way that people on the frontier helped each other through hard circumstance. But this was different. The Blackthorn brand on her skin meant her situation was not ordinary trouble. He sat in the hallway with his back against the wall, and his knees up, and his hat over his face, and listened to the quiet sounds from behind the door. The pour of water, the scrape of the chair, silence that stretched and stretched. After a while, she opened the door. She'd cleaned herself up as much as she could with a basin of water and a rough cloth. The swelling on her jaw was still bad, and the eyes still mostly shut, but she'd gotten the blood and the road dust off her face, and she looked, not better exactly, but more like herself. He thought that was probably true anyway. He didn't actually know what she looked like when things were going normally for her. She looked at him sitting on the floor in the hallway. "You're staying out there," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Someone should keep watch. She considered this. Then she said, "There's a chair inside." He moved the chair to the doorway and sat in it with the door open at his back. She sat on the edge of the bed with the half-eaten plate of beans in her lap and looked out the single window at the fading light, and neither of them said anything for a while. "The man in the trading post," she said finally. "Emmett. He didn't know me. I came in off the road because I was out of water, and he could see something was wrong, and he was going to let me sleep in the back room for the night. That's all." She paused. "They came that same evening. Blackthorn men? 3 of them, looking for me specifically." She said it without inflection, but Gideon heard something under the words, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been hunted long enough that it no longer surprises them. Emmett told them he hadn't seen me. They didn't believe him. And they killed him. He fought back. Her jaw tightened. He was 60 years old, and he fought 3 of them with a broom handle before they got him down. He didn't have to do that. He didn't know me. Gideon didn't say anything. I keep thinking about that, she said. About people who do things they don't have to do. The night came down slowly over the flat country outside the window. Somewhere in the settlement, a dog was barking at something it couldn't identify in the dark. Rowan finished the beans and set the plate on the floor and lay back on the bed without taking her boots off, one arm over her eyes. "Thank you," she said to the ceiling, "for coming back there. I wasn't going to leave you." Most people would. He didn't argue the point, because she wasn't wrong about most people. "Get some sleep," he said instead. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." She slept for 14 hours. Gideon dozed in the chair, woke periodically to check the window and the hallway, and was up before dawn making inquiries with the rooming house proprietor about whether anyone had come through asking questions. Nobody had, not yet. He got coffee from the kitchen and sat with it on the porch and watched the gray light come up over the flats and thought about the Blackthorn brand and about what it meant that they were hunting this particular woman this hard. When Rowan finally woke, she came out onto the porch and stood there for a moment with her hands wrapped around a tin mug of her own and looked at the morning like someone getting reacquainted with the concept of daylight. She looked better than the day before. Her eye had opened to about half, which was an improvement. She'd found somewhere a spare shirt from the rooming house stores. It was too big for her, a man's work shirt in faded blue, and she'd rolled the sleeves to the elbow. The swelling on her jaw had gone down slightly, enough that you could see the actual shape of her face now, angular, sharp at the cheekbones, with a mouth that looked like it spent more time pressed flat in thought than it did in any expression that could be called easy. She sat down on the step beside him without asking if there was room. "You were quiet all night," she said. "So were you. I heard you check the window twice." She looked at him sideways. "You're not just a rancher passing through." "I'm exactly a rancher passing through," he said. "I just don't sleep deeply when there's a reason not to." She made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been skepticism. Hard to tell. She drank her coffee. "The brand," Gideon said after a moment. He kept his eyes on the flats. "You don't have to tell me how you got it." "I know I don't. But I'd like to understand what we're dealing with if they're going to come looking in this direction." She was quiet for a long stretch, long enough that he thought she'd decided not to answer. Then she said, "My brother's name was Cass Hale. He worked freighting routes for 3 years, legitimate work, good pay. About 18 months ago, he started noticing things on the routes he ran for a company called Meridian Transport." She stopped, turned the mug in her hands. Meridian Transport was Blackthorn. Not obviously. On paper, it was a legitimate freight company with contracts and offices and a name on a door. But what was actually moving on some of those routes wasn't goods. People, Gideon said. Girls, mostly. Young ones, coming out of settlements that didn't have enough law to ask questions. Her voice was still flat, but something had gone hard underneath it. Cass kept records. He was careful about it. He knew what he was looking at, and he knew what it meant. So he kept everything written down in a ledger he carried on him. Names, dates, routes, cargo manifests that didn't match what was actually loaded. He sent me a letter about it, told me what he'd found, told me he was going to take it to a federal marshal he knew in Weston County. He never made it, Gideon said. They found the letter. I don't know how. I was living with our aunt in Sutter Creek, 300 miles from Cass's road. But they came for him first. By the time I heard what had happened and got to the town where he'd last been seen, she stopped again. They'd been in that town ahead of me. People who knew Cass, who'd talked to Cass, had already been paid or threatened into silence. And there was a man waiting for me at the boarding house where I'd asked after him. Blackthorn? One of their collectors. That's what they call the ones who clean things up. He told me that my brother had met with an accident and that it would be a shame if the same thing happened to me, and that if I had any papers or letters from my brother, I should hand them over and go home and forget I had a brother named Cass. Gideon looked at her. I ran, she said. I know how that sounds. It sounds like sense. It wasn't courage. She said it sharply, like she'd had this argument with herself more than once. I panicked. I ran and kept running for weeks before I started thinking straight again. You had the letter Cass sent you. She nodded. I'd memorized most of it before I ran. The details he'd given me. The routes, the dates, the names he'd seen on the manifests. I burned the actual letter after I'd committed it to memory. There were other things, too. Cass had sent me a package before the letter, said to keep it safe and only open it if something happened to him. I opened it. She glanced at Gideon. Records. Shibats. Not the full ledger. I think that was on him when they killed him. But copies of key pages he'd made and mailed to me separately. Smart. He was always smarter than me. Where are those records now? Hidden. She said it simply, without specifying, and he didn't push. The brand, he said. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. When they caught me, about 3 weeks before you found me, they'd been running me down for months by then. The man in charge wanted to make sure that if I ran again, anyone who found me would know I belonged to them, that I wasn't a person to help. She turned slightly, and through the open collar of the too big shirt, he could see the edge of the mark on her shoulder. It's a message, not just to me. The dog from the night before had apparently resolved its dispute with whatever it had been barking at. The morning was quiet. A wagon was moving somewhere on the far road, its wheels raising a thin line of dust against the sky. My father had a ranch, Gideon said. He hadn't intended to say it. It came out flat, just a statement. South of here, back in the territory. He ran cattle on good land, not a big operation, but a solid one. When I was about 16, the Blackthorn men came through. They wanted the water rights. There was a spring on our property that fed a creek that they needed to control a route they were developing. He paused. They sent a notice first. 3 days to sign over the deed. My father refused. Rowan was looking at him now. They came back on the second day, burned the barn, killed 2 of our men, left another notice. He kept his voice even. It was a thing he'd had years of practice keeping even. My father signed. We moved to a rental property outside Colton. He died 2 years later of nothing particular. Just stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped being interested in anything. My mother said it was his heart. He looked at his coffee. I don't know what I'd call it. Where are you now? She asked. I mean, what do you do? I work cattle for other men mostly. I don't own land. He said it without apology, but also without pretending it wasn't what it was. And the Blackthorn outfit? They're bigger now than they were then. 10 years ago, they were just a criminal organization running protection and freight fraud in a few counties. Now, he stopped. Now they're bigger. She nodded slowly. I know what they are now. The coffee had gone cold. Gideon set the mug on the step. Those records you have hidden, he said. Are they enough? To build something against them? I mean, something that would hold up, legally. Something that couldn't be buried. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Not hedging, just thinking. The records from Cass alone? Probably not. They're specific to one freight route over about 8 months. Damaging, but Blackthorn would find a way to explain them, discredit them, pay whoever needed to be paid. She looked out at the flats. But I spent months running from them before they caught me. And running gave me time to think, and thinking gave me other ideas. There are people along the routes Cass ran who know what they saw. There are men who worked for Meridian Transport who might talk if they thought they were safe enough to do it. There are... She stopped, reconsidered. I had a plan before they caught me. A way to get enough evidence together in one place that it couldn't be quietly buried. It would take time, and it would take help, and it would take going back to places I'd already been run out of. Tell me the plan, Gideon said. She looked at him with that gray assessment again. Why? It was a fair question. He thought about how to answer it honestly. Because they destroyed my father, he said finally. And they're still out there. And I've been telling myself for 12 years that it wasn't my problem to fix because I wasn't the one who could fix it. He looked at her. And then I walked into a storage room and found you. And I don't think that's an accident. It is an accident, she said. Completely. You needed a rifle. I know. I'm saying, I don't know. I'm saying I want to help. She looked at him for a long time. You could get killed, she said. Not a warning, exactly. More like a condition she was setting out clearly before any agreement was made. That's true of most things worth doing out here. She turned back to the flats. Her jaw was set and her good eye was narrow, and she looked like someone calculating the distance of a jump they weren't sure they could make. The plan, she said, starts with a town called Mineral Fork. They stayed at Hector's Crossing for 2 more days because Rowan needed the time and because moving too fast without a direction was just running. Gideon bought supplies, food, ammunition, a second horse for Rowan from a man in the settlement who sold horses out of a corral behind his house and didn't ask where you were going. The horse was a plain brown mare with a white sock on her left forefoot, unremarkable in every way, which suited their needs perfectly. He also bought a rifle. That part had been the original plan, after all. During those 2 days, Rowan talked. Not constantly, not without stopping, but in the way someone talks when they've been silent for too long, and the silence has started to cost more than the talking would. She told him about Cass, not the evidence, but the man himself. How he'd learned to read from their mother using a single book on natural history, and had consequently known a startling amount about the migration patterns of birds. How he'd had a particular laugh that came out of him sideways, like he was trying to suppress it, and couldn't. How he'd sent her money every month that she'd told him she didn't need and he'd sent anyway. Gideon listened. He didn't try to make it easier or more bearable, or tell her that Cass had been brave or that it meant something. She wasn't asking for that. She was just telling him who her brother had been, so that she wouldn't be the only person left who knew. In return, he told her about Calder County, where he'd spent the better part of 3 years running cattle for a rancher named Jim Potts, who had been a fair employer and a decent man and had died of fever the previous winter. He told her about the work itself, the specific physical logic of moving animals across distance, the way weather and terrain and the behavior of cattle made every drive different, the way you learned to read the land just by moving through it enough times. He didn't tell her much more about his father. He'd said what he'd said, and that was the kind of thing that didn't bear repeating. On the second night, she spread Cass's copied records on the table in her room and showed him what they had. He leaned over the table beside her and looked at dates and names and route numbers written in a hand that was clearly not Rowan's. Smaller, neater, more careful. The records covered 8 months of freight operations, with notes in the margins that showed Cass had been cross-referencing manifests. There were 3 specific entries marked with a double line in the margin. "Those are the ones that name names," Rowan said, tapping one. People Cass actually identified. Not just freight accounts, but individuals. Men in the Blackthorn organization who oversaw those particular routes. Gideon studied the names. He didn't recognize any of them, but he recognized the organizational structure they implied. Multiple layers, geographical spread, the careful anonymization of the leadership that meant even someone like Cass, who'd had access to freight records from the inside, had only been able to identify the middle tier. "How high does this go?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. I know there are 3 men at the top of it, the ones who actually built the outfit. The rest is hierarchy beneath them." She pulled back the folded edge of one page to show handwriting that continued on to the back. Cass heard names at the top level, overheard them once in a conversation he was close enough to catch pieces of. He wrote them down. But names aren't evidence. "No," Gideon agreed. "You'd need something that puts those men to actions." "Which is why Mineral Fork," she said. "There was a man on that route, a station agent, runs a freight depot there. Name of Augustus Reed. He's not Blackthorn, but he knew what was moving through his depot, and he took a fee to look the other way. He kept his own records. Cass knew about them because Reed told him once. I think he was scared and looking for someone to confess to." She looked at Gideon. "If Reed would talk, and if he'd hand over what he's kept, we'd have records from 2 separate sources covering the same period. That's harder to bury." "If he'd talk," Gideon said. "A man who took fees from the Blackthorn outfit is a man who knows what happens to people who cause them problems." "Yes." She straightened and rolled the records back up carefully. "That's why we don't ask him. We convince him." "There's a difference?" "There's a significant difference." She tied the roll with a piece of cord and tucked it back into the lining of her saddlebag, which she'd rigged with a hidden pocket. Asking gives him a choice. Convincing means making his options clear enough that cooperating becomes the obvious one. Gideon looked at her. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. "I've had nothing to do but think for a long time," she said. "And some of it—" She paused, and something in her face shifted briefly, went somewhere difficult, and came back. "Some of it I worked out lying in that storage room at Caldwell's Creek, listening to Emmett Caldwell's body in the next room and trying to figure out how I was going to get out of this. Whether I was going to get out of this." She said it like a fact, but he heard what lived underneath it. You could have run, he said, when you got out, when I got you out. You could have taken your aunt's money and gone somewhere they'd never heard of the Blackthorn outfit. I thought about it. She said it without shame. For about 2 hours, while you were sitting in the hallway and I was lying on that bed. Her expression was direct. And then I thought about Cass, and I thought about those girls in the freight wagons, and I thought about Emmett Caldwell hitting 3 men with a broom handle because it was the right thing to do. She looked at him steadily. And I thought, I can't just be someone who ran, even if running is the sensible thing, even if it keeps me alive. I can't just be that. Gideon was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Tell me more about Augustus Reed. They left Hector's Crossing before dawn on the 3rd morning, moving south on the valley road with the early light coming gray and cold at their backs. Rowan rode the brown mare steadily, not comfortably. She was still hurt in ways she wasn't telling him about, and he could see it in the set of her shoulders when the mare stepped uneven ground, but with a particular stubborn competence that he was starting to recognize as just how she moved through things. Mineral Fork was 3 days south, if they kept reasonable pace and stayed off the main routes. Gideon rode beside her on Calder and kept his eyes on the horizon, and thought about what they were moving toward. He'd spent 12 years doing his job, moving cattle, not looking directly at the thing that had ended his father's world. He'd told himself it wasn't his problem because it wasn't a problem one man could fix, and that was true. It was also convenient, and he was aware of the convenience. Rowan Hale was not a woman you helped without consequence. She was going back into the fire on purpose, with a plan that was partially formed and a set of records that were necessary but not sufficient, and a conviction that the right people in the right positions could be moved to act if someone put the evidence in front of them. It was not a comfortable plan. It was not a plan that guaranteed any particular outcome. It was the only plan there was. The valley road ran straight south for miles before it bent toward the hill country, and the land on either side was dry and wide, and the sky above it was that particular pale blue of early autumn that somehow looked colder than it actually was. Somewhere ahead of them, a settlement called Mineral Fork held a frightened freight depot agent who kept records in a place he probably hoped nobody would ever look. Rowan rode at an easy lope, the mare matching Calder's pace without being asked, and she didn't look back at the road they'd come from. Gideon looked back once. There was nobody on the road behind them. Not yet. The mark on her skin and the names in the records and the ghost of his father's face all rode with them south through the dry October morning, and the land gave nothing away about what was waiting for them at the other end of it. The valley road narrowed as they moved into the hill country south of Hector's Crossing, the flat scrub giving way to low ridgelines covered in dry brush and pale rock. By the 2nd day of riding, Gideon had developed a rough sense of Rowan's rhythms, when she needed to stop and when she was pushing through something she wasn't going to admit to, when she was thinking hard, and when she was just watching the country. She didn't make noise about pain, but she'd dismount carefully, always leading with her right side, and when she thought he wasn't watching, she'd press her hand against her left ribs. He didn't say anything about it. She hadn't asked him to manage her condition, and pointing it out would accomplish nothing except make her defensive. On the evening of the 2nd day, they camped in a hollow off the road where a low sandstone outcrop blocked the wind and provided some screen from the trail. Gideon built a small fire, the kind that gives enough heat to cook over without throwing light you could see from a distance. Rowan sat with her back against the sandstone and turned one of Cass's copied record pages in her hands. Not reading it, he thought, just holding it. Read, she said without preamble. I need you to understand what kind of man we're dealing with before we get there. Gideon set the coffee pot at the edge of the coals. Go ahead. He's not a bad man exactly. He's a scared one. There's a difference. She folded the page along its original crease. Cass said he was decent enough in ordinary dealing, fair with his workers, not the kind of man who'd steal outright. He took the Blackthorn fee because they made the alternative clear enough that he believed them, and once you've taken that first fee, you're inside the arrangement. You can't back out without giving them something to use against you. So he's compromised, and he knows it. He's been living inside it for 3 years, which means he's had 3 years to think about what happens if it all comes apart. She looked at the folded page. Men like that can go either way when something shifts. They either dig in harder and protect themselves by protecting the people who own them, or they grab the first clean exit they're offered because they've been waiting for it without knowing they were waiting. Which way do you think Reed goes? She was quiet for a moment, the fire snapping once between them. I think he goes toward the exit, but I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. She said the last part without apology, and Gideon thought that was more honest than most people managed about their own judgment. If he goes the other way, Gideon said, and alerts them that we came to him, then we have maybe 12 hours before Blackthorn men are on the road toward Mineral Fork, she said, which is why we don't come in cold. I want to watch the depot for a day before we make contact, see how Reed moves, who he talks to, whether there's anyone in the settlement that looks like they're watching. Smart. She gave him a look that wasn't quite impatient but was adjacent to it. I've been keeping myself alive for 18 months with nothing but smart and luck, and the luck has been inconsistent. She set the record page down on top of her saddlebag. I don't need you to tell me it's smart. I need you to tell me if you see a problem with it. Fair enough, Gideon thought. The depot, he said. Public-facing business. People coming and going for legitimate freight. We'd need somewhere to watch from that doesn't make us obvious. Two strangers sitting on a hill over a small settlement get noticed. There's a feed store across the road from the depot. Cass mentioned it in his letters, said it was the kind of place where travelers stopped to rest horses and nobody paid attention to who was there. She looked at him. I think we come in as a couple, husband and wife, moving through. It reads as ordinary and it gives us a reason to linger without drawing questions. Gideon picked up his coffee cup and considered this. That'll work, he said. She studied him for a second, like she'd expected some reaction to the word couple, and was slightly wrong-footed by the absence of one. Then she nodded. Good. The fire burned down to orange coals. Outside the hollow, the wind picked up over the ridge and moved through the dry brush with a long, low sound. Rowan lay down with her jacket folded under her head and her rifle within reach, and she was asleep inside 10 minutes, which he'd noticed was a capability she had. The ability to go under fast, like a switch being thrown. The way soldiers sometimes did when they'd trained themselves to sleep, whenever the chance presented itself, because they'd learned not to count on when the next chance would come. He kept watch until midnight, then woke her and slept himself, and neither of them dreamed, or at least neither of them said so. Mineral Fork was a legitimate town, which meant it had more than 100 residents and enough ongoing commerce to justify a dry goods store, a livery, a small hotel, a saloon, and the Meridian Transport Freight Depot that sat at the southern end of the main street behind a set of loading docks and a fenced yard where wagons were staged for loading and offloading. It wasn't a prosperous town particularly, but it was a functioning one, and it had the particular quality of settlements that existed because geography required them. The road through it was the only practical road through this part of the hill country, so things moved through Mineral Fork whether they wanted to or not. They came in from the north on a Wednesday morning, riding easy, Rowan with her hat pulled low and her collar up against the October chill. From a distance, they looked like any couple coming into a supply town, which was the intention. The feed store across from the depot was exactly what Rowan had described. A wide, low building with a covered porch where a couple of old men occupied chairs with the permanent quality of men who had been in those chairs since approximately the founding of the settlement. Gideon tied both horses at the rail, and they went inside and bought a small quantity of grain for the horses, which was a reasonable purchase, and spent 20 minutes moving slowly around the store, looking at things they had no intention of buying, which gave them a view through the front windows of the depot across the road. Nothing remarkable happening. A freight wagon in the yard, 2 workers moving crates. A man in the depot office, visible through the window. Heavy-set, older, moving slowly with the walk of someone who'd been sitting too long. That's him, Rowan said quietly, from beside a rack of bridal hardware. Third window from the left. Gideon looked. Augustus Reed was perhaps 55, with gray in his hair and a permanent stoop that might have been the weight of the work, or might have been something else he was carrying. He moved through the depot office with the tired efficiency of a man going through motions he'd been going through too long. He looked scared, Gideon said. He's always scared, Rowan said, but the question is whether he's scared enough. They got a room at the hotel, husband and wife, traveling through, paid a week in advance, which the proprietor appreciated, and which meant they wouldn't be commented on or remembered as people with something to hide. Rowan sat at the window that afternoon and watched the depot, and Gideon walked the town slowly, getting a feel for who was in it. He counted, by the end of the afternoon, Three men who didn't fit the town's working character. They were in the saloon, spread out at separate tables, not talking to each other, but with the particular quality of men who were present in a place for a reason that had nothing to do with the whiskey in front of them. He went back to the hotel room and told Rowan. She absorbed this without visible surprise. Watchers, she said. Blackthorn? Or paid by them. Reed probably doesn't know they're there, or he knows and has stopped noticing because they've been there long enough. She turned from the window. They're not watching for us specifically. They'd have made a move already. They're just watching, keeping tabs on what moves through the depot. If we make contact with Reed and they see it, they'll report it, and we'll have less time than I thought. She pressed her mouth flat. Which means we need to move faster than I wanted to. They were quiet for a moment. Tonight, she said, after the depot closes, I know how these freight depots are laid out. There'll be a side entrance for the agent, separate from the loading dock. We go in quiet. We talk to him where the watchers in the saloon can't see. And if he's not alone, he lives at the depot. It was his father's operation before it was his. There's quarters in the back. She looked at Gideon steadily. He'll be alone. You're sure? No, she said. I'm not sure, but it's what we have. They went at 2 a.m, when the saloon had been dark for an hour and the street was empty. Mineral Fork at 2 a.m. was a collection of rectangles of faint light from windows where people hadn't yet put out their lamps, and the distant sound of a horse somewhere in the livery shifting its weight, and nothing else. The temperature had dropped to the edge of cold. The side entrance to the depot was where Rowan had predicted it would be. A plain door at the east wall, separate from the main loading entrance. A lamp burned low in the window beside it, which meant someone was still up, or had left it burning. Rowan knocked twice, then once, which was not a normal sequence. For a moment nothing happened, then there was movement behind the door. The sound of someone stopping, then moving more carefully, then stopping again. Then the door opened 4 inches, the chain still on, and a man's face appeared in the gap. And even in the dim light, Gideon could see the specific quality of his fear. It was the fear of someone who had been expecting exactly this kind of knock. Who are you? Augustus Reed said, in a voice barely above a whisper. My name is Rowan Hale, she said. I'm Cass Hale's sister. The silence that followed was very complete. Then Reed said, in almost no voice at all, Oh no. We need to talk, she said. Please let us in. He let them in. He didn't look happy about it. The back quarters of the depot were functional and sparse. A stove, a table, 2 chairs that didn't match, shelves of ledgers and paper files, a cot against the far wall with a rough blanket. It smelled like ink and coal smoke, and the particular institutional smell of a place where paperwork was the dominant activity. Reed stood with his arms crossed over his chest in the posture of a man trying to hold himself together from the outside. He was older up close than he'd looked through the window. The gray in his hair was complete, not partial, and his face had the lined, compressed look of a man who'd spent years not sleeping well. His eyes moved between Rowan and Gideon with a rapid, assessing quality that confirmed what she'd said. This was a man who'd been waiting and calculating for a long time. Your brother is dead, he said to Rowan. It came out flat, not cruel, just the statement of a fact he'd been sitting with. I know, she said. I tried. He stopped. His jaw worked. I heard about it 2 weeks after it happened. There wasn't anything I could have done. I want you to understand that I couldn't have. I'm not here to blame you for Cass, she said. Her voice was steady. I'm here because of what you know and what you've kept. His eyes went narrow. I don't know what you mean. You kept records, she said. Your own records, separate from the official manifests. Cass told me. He said you'd been keeping them since the 2nd year, that you had them somewhere safe. She looked at him steadily. I need them. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the depot, something settled. Timber contracting in the cold, or just the building making the sounds old buildings make at night. If I gave you anything, Reed said carefully, and if anyone found out, these people, they don't... He stopped again, pressed one hand flat on the table. Miss Hale? I have a daughter in Callaway. She's 12 years old and she lives with her mother, and I send them money every month. That's how they got me into this. They knew about her. They told me, he exhaled. They told me accidents happen to children too. Gideon felt something cold go through him. Not surprise, exactly. Just the particular chill of hearing something you'd suspected confirmed in plain language. Rowan didn't look away from Reed. "I know," she said, and her voice had changed slightly. Still steady, but with something underneath it now that wasn't hard or prosecutorial. "I know that's how they work. And I know you've been living in this for 3 years because you had no way out that didn't put your daughter at risk." She paused. "But you've been keeping those records anyway. In spite of all of that, you've been documenting what you've seen." Reed looked at the table. "Why?" she said. "If you were just protecting yourself and your daughter, you'd have stopped keeping records 2 years ago. Why did you keep them?" The silence stretched. Reed's hand was still flat on the table. His thumbnail was pressing hard into the wood grain, white at the tip from the pressure. "Because somebody should know," he said finally. "Because those girls, the ones moving through my depot in sealed wagons, I looked in one once. I don't know why I did it. I wish I hadn't." His voice had gone rough. "I looked in one, and I can't." He stopped completely for a moment. When he started again, his voice was lower. "Somebody should know what happened. Even if I can't say it, even if I never say a word of it aloud, somebody should know." No one spoke. Rowan reached into her coat and laid Cass's copied records on the table in front of Reed. He looked at them. He looked at the handwriting, and something in his face cracked slightly at the edges. "He was a good man," Reed said. "Your brother. Better than he had to be." "I know," she said. "What would you do with my records?" he asked. "Specifically, if I gave them to you, what does that look like?" This was the question, Gideon thought. This was the actual question under all the rest of it. Rowan told him. She laid it out cleanly, without overselling it. What she had, what she needed, who she believed could act on combined evidence from 2 independent sources, what the process would involve, what the risks were. She didn't promise him his daughter would be safe. She didn't promise him he wouldn't face consequences for the fees he'd taken. She told him what was true, that the records, combined, might be enough to bring federal attention to Blackthorn's operations in this territory in a way that couldn't be quietly bought off, and that federal attention of the right kind was the only thing that could actually end the outfit's ability to threaten people like his daughter. "Might," Reed said. "Might," she confirmed. "I won't tell you it's certain. Nothing about this is certain." He sat with it for a long moment, and Gideon watched him and thought about how much courage it took to make a decision like this. Not the dramatic, sudden kind of courage, but the slow, grinding kind that required a person to weigh their own fear against something larger and make a choice with full knowledge that both paths could end badly. "I keep them in the floor," Reed said at last. "Under the 3rd board from the north wall, behind the coal box." He stood up heavily, like the decision had physical weight. "I'll get them." What Reed had kept was more than Rowan had expected, which was the best kind of surprise. 4 years of freight manifests annotated in his own hand, with notes in the margins that were precise and specific. Dates, wagon numbers, what the official manifest said, and in a separate column in red ink, what he'd actually observed. The red ink column was damning. Names of Blackthorn-connected men appeared repeatedly against specific entries. The scale of what had moved through Mineral Fork Depot alone over 4 years was enough to turn a stomach. He also had something else. A letter. Sealed, addressed, written, and ready to send. The name on the front was a federal marshal in a city 300 miles north. "I wrote it 8 months ago," Reed said. "Couldn't send it. Every time I got close, I thought about Elena. That's my daughter. And I put it back in the floor." "Can I read it?" Rowan asked. He handed it over. She broke the seal carefully and read it, and Gideon watched her face while she did. The expression that moved through her wasn't readable exactly, but it wasn't nothing. "This is good," she said quietly. Augustus, this is very good." Something in him seemed to ease slightly at that, like a knot loosening one strand. "There are people on those routes," Gideon said. "Other depot agents, other freight workers. People who saw what Cass saw. Some of them," Reed said. "I know 3 personally, men who were in the same position I was. I can give you their names." "Would they talk?" "If they thought it would hold," Reed said. If they thought someone with actual authority was going to act on it and not just take the information and disappear it. He looked at both of them. The problem's never been finding people who know things. The problem's always been finding someone you could give it to who the Blackthorn people couldn't buy. This was the piece Rowan had been turning over since before Gideon had found her, he realized. Not just the evidence, the delivery mechanism. Evidence given to the wrong hands was evidence destroyed. They needed someone with federal reach and a reason not to cooperate with the outfit, which meant someone who had no pre-existing arrangement with them and enough authority that the outfit couldn't easily threaten them directly. The marshal in Weston County, Rowan said, the one Cass was going to, I looked into him after. I had contacts do it quietly. He's clean. He's had 2 attempts to bribe him and rejected both, and the second one he reported to his federal superior. He's been trying to build a case against Blackthorn for 2 years, and he can't get enough evidence to get authorization to act. 2 independent sets of records plus testimony from 3 more witnesses, Gideon said. Is that enough? It's a start, she said. It's enough to get him authorization to start an official investigation. An official investigation means subpoena power, federal jurisdiction, and something that can't be quietly paid off at the county level. She folded Reed's letter back along its crease. It's the lever we need. Reed had been listening to this exchange with an expression caught between hope and the specific anxiety of a man who has done something irreversible and isn't sure yet if it was the right thing. The Watchers, Gideon said to Rowan, the 3 men in the saloon, if they've seen us, they haven't, she said, but we can't know that for certain, and we can't be in Mineral Fork when daylight comes. She looked at Reed. Pack what you need for 3 days. Nothing that looks like a permanent departure. Leave the ledgers that are supposed to be here. Leave the depot looking normal. Can you have someone you trust run it for a few days? Reed blinked. You want me to come with you? You and your records, Sute, she said. Until we reach Weston County. Once you've made your statement to the marshal in person, with the records as evidence, that's when the official protection starts. That's when it becomes more dangerous to move against you than to let the process run. She looked at him steadily. Right now you're just a freight depot agent in a small town. Nobody's watching you because nobody knows you're a risk. The moment they find out what you've given us, that changes. I'd rather you be 100 miles away from Mineral Fork when that happens. Reed stood there for a long moment in the coal smoke smell of his quarters, his hand on the table, looking at the annotated manifests and the unsent letter and the copied pages of Cass Hale's careful handwriting. My daughter, he said. It wasn't a question, not exactly. Weston County is 4 days' ride from Callaway, Rowan said. Once the federal investigation opens officially, the marshal can arrange for her to be moved somewhere safe through channels that don't pass through anyone connected to Blackthorn's network. She paused. I can't tell you it works out perfectly. I can tell you that this is the path that gives her the best chance of being outside their reach permanently, instead of just hoping they keep their word. Reed looked at her for a long time. Cass wrote about you in his letters, he said. He said you were the stubborn one. He said you'd argue a stone wall into moving if you had enough time. Something flickered across Rowan's face, a private pain, there and gone. He wasn't wrong, she said. All right, Reed said. He straightened, and Gideon could see the decision settle into him, the way a man's posture changes when he's stopped weighing something and committed to the direction. Give me 20 minutes. They were out of Mineral Fork before the first light touched the eastern ridge. 3 riders on the dark road moving north. Gideon on Calder, Rowan on the brown mare, Reed on a depot horse he'd left a note claiming he was taking for a supply run. The road was cold and empty, and the hill country lay around them in dark shapes against a sky that was just beginning, at the very edge, to consider the idea of morning. Reed rode behind them and didn't say much for the first hour. He had a canvas bag tied to his saddle horn that contained his records, and he kept one hand on it in the unconscious way of a man protecting something he spent years protecting. At a junction where the road split toward the flatlands, Rowan reined the mare in briefly and looked at both directions, then took the eastern branch instead of the more direct northern route. Longer, Gideon said. And harder to predict, she said. If the watchers in the saloon noticed anything unusual and reported it overnight, the logical assumption is we go north direct. She glanced back at Reed. Nobody sends a pursuit east first. Reed made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been the horse shifting under him. You do this much? He asked Gideon. This kind of thing? No, Gideon said. This is new for me. Reed digested that. You and the girl, we met about a week ago, Gideon said. Another silence. She's something, Reed said finally. Not admiringly exactly. More the way you'd describe a weather event, something you couldn't argue with or redirect. Yes, Gideon said. She is. The eastern road climbed into rougher country, switchbacking up through dry scrub and loose shale country where the horses picked their footing more carefully. By mid-morning, they were high enough that the flatlands below were visible in a haze, and the road behind them was empty as far as Gideon could see when he turned to look. Rowan rode ahead, hat pulled low, one hand easy on the reins. She hadn't looked back at the road at all. He didn't know if that was confidence or something else. The particular forward-facing quality of someone who'd decided not to count what was behind them because they couldn't afford to. Either way, it suited the road they were on. The sky went gray by noon, threatening something that might be rain or might be nothing. The way October weather in the hill country couldn't be trusted to follow through on what it promised. Reed's horse stumbled once on a loose patch, and he caught it without drama, resettled himself, kept going. 4 days to Weston County, if the weather held and the road cooperated and nothing came at them from the direction they weren't watching. Gideon kept his eyes on the horizon and his hand near his rifle, and didn't put any particular faith in 4 out of those 3 conditions holding. But they were moving, and they had what they'd come for, and somewhere behind them Mineral Forks Freight Depot was opening for the morning as if nothing had shifted in the night. It was a start. The rain that had threatened all of the second day finally came down on the third morning. Not a dramatic storm, but the slow, persistent kind that soaks through everything gradually and makes a misery of travel without the decency of being impressive about it. The eastern road had softened to mud in the lower sections, and the horses moved through it with the labored patience of animals that knew the work had gotten harder and hadn't been consulted about it. Reed had stopped being quiet around the end of the second day. Somewhere between the hill country and the flatlands opening north, he'd begun to talk, carefully at first, then with the loosening quality of someone who'd been holding things at compression for years and found the pressure finally releasing. He talked about the depot, about the routes, about specific instances he'd documented, and what it had cost him to document them and say nothing. And Rowan listened with complete attention and asked precise questions that pulled more detail out of him, and Gideon rode slightly ahead of them and let it happen, because what Reed was doing was not just providing evidence. He was unburdening himself. And a man who'd unburdened himself was a man who'd committed, in a way that went past rational calculation, to the direction he'd chosen. By the third morning, riding through the gray curtain of rain with their hats pulled down and their coat collars up, the 3 of them had the specific quality of people who'd been through enough discomfort together to have stopped being strangers without quite becoming something more defined. "Tell me about the convoy," Rowan said, during a stretch where the road ran straight between 2 low ridges. She said it to Reed, but she said it quietly, like she'd been working up to it. Reed was quiet for a moment. His horse splashed through a shallow runnel of rainwater crossing the road. "Which one?" "The one scheduled for the end of this month. I know there's one. There was a notation in your records from 6 weeks ago. A routing change for the Meridian convoy, shifted from the Ochre Flats Road to the Eastern Pass." Reed's jaw moved slightly. "You read everything." "I read everything," she confirmed. Another silence. Rain tapped steadily on hat brims and shoulders. "End of October," Reed said finally. "Large convoy. Meridian running it, but the cargo designation on the official manifest is hardware and dry goods for 3 settlements in the Northern Territory." He paused, and the pause had weight. "I've seen that routing designation before. Hardware and dry goods. 40% of the time when Meridian uses that designation on the Eastern Pass route, it's not hardware." Gideon had been listening without turning around. He turned around now. "How many girls?" Rowan said. Her voice didn't change. "I don't know for certain. The convoy size, 6 wagons from the advanced scheduling notice I saw. If it's consistent with past operations," he trailed off. 15 to 20, Rowan said, based on what Cass documented for convoy operations of that size. "Approximately," Reed said. The rain came down. Gideon looked at Rowan. She was staring ahead at the road, her face still and her jaw set, and he knew what she was thinking because he was thinking the same thing. that they were 4 days from Weston County and whatever official process might begin there, and the Eastern Pass was not 4 days from Weston County. It was 2 days north and east of where they currently were. "Rowan," he said. "I know," she said. "If we divert, I know. The marshal's office, the official process. That's the piece that makes the rest of this work permanently. If we go after a convoy with 3 people, we compromise. Gideon." She said his name level and flat. "I said I know." She kept her eyes on the road. "I'm doing the math." He let it sit. The math she was doing was not simple arithmetic. It was the calculus of a person trying to weigh an immediate specific harm against the larger structural harm. And the problem with that kind of calculation was that the immediate specific harm had faces. It had the face of a girl in a sealed wagon on a 2-day route through rough country to wherever the Blackthorn outfit sold people. The structural harm had records and manifests and the impersonal promise of federal process. He couldn't make that calculation for her. He wasn't sure he could make it cleanly for himself. They rode for another mile in the rain without speaking. "There's a man," Reed said carefully, from behind them, "in a settlement called Drayford, about a day's ride from the Eastern Pass. Former Blackthorn man, he drove routes for them for 2 years before he got out. His name is Virgil Thatch. He came to me once, about 18 months ago, asking if I knew anyone who was doing something about them. I didn't then." He paused. "I gave him my name as a contact. Old habit from when I was young and stupider and believed things could be fixed by people willing to fix them." Rowan turned in the saddle to look at him. "Is he trustworthy?" "I don't know him well enough to say he's trustworthy," Reed said. "I know he was willing to drive 2 days out of his way to find someone to ask, and I know he left the outfit, which is not an easy thing to do, and stay alive." "Why did he leave?" Reed met her eyes. "Same reason I kept those records. He looked in a wagon." The rain eased slightly, going from steady to intermittent, the kind that might stop or might decide to recommit. Gideon's coat was wet through at the shoulders, and the water had found the gap at his collar and made a cold line down the back of his neck. And he thought about the convoy on the Eastern Pass, and about 15 to 20 faces he didn't know in sealed wagons, and about the difference between what could be done now and what could be done in 2 months after a federal investigation got organized. "We go to Drayford," he said. Rowan looked at him. "We get Thatch," he said. "We find out what he knows about the convoy route. We send Reed on to Weston County with the records and a letter for the marshal. Written out today, sealed, specific. The marshal starts his official process." He kept his voice level. "And we deal with the convoy." "The 3 of us won't deal with a 6-wagon convoy," she said. "I know," he said. "Thatch would be 4. How many other former Blackthorn men are there in settlements along that route who walked away for the same reason he did?" She was quiet, thinking. "There are survivors too," she said. "People whose families were—" She stopped, recalibrated. "When I was running, I stayed in settlements along those routes. I met people. A woman in Cutter's Bend who lost her daughter to a Meridian wagon 3 years ago and had never been able to do anything about it. A man in Ridgeholm who had documentation of a Blackthorn protection racket that had been running his neighbors off their land for 2 years. She looked at Gideon. "I didn't have anything to offer them then. I had nothing but my own situation and a plan that wasn't built yet. And now?" She looked down at her hands on the reins for a moment. "Now I have records and a federal contact and a convoy timeline. And me," Gideon said. Something shifted in her expression. Not sentiment, but an acknowledgement of something real. "And you," she said. Reed cleared his throat from behind them. "I'll go to Weston County alone," he said. I won't be useful in what you're describing. I'm a depot agent, not a fighting man, and I know it. But I can deliver the records, I can give the statement, I know the federal marshal's name, and I can make the case clearly." He looked at Rowan. "Write me the letter. Tell me exactly what you need him to understand and to do." She held his gaze. "You'll be all right? Alone?" "I've been alone with this for 3 years," he said. 4 more days won't change that arithmetic." They split at a junction west of Drayford, mid-afternoon of the 3rd day, the rain finally gone and the country around them drying slowly in weak autumn sun. Reed took the northern road with the canvas bag strapped to his saddle horn and a sealed letter in his inside coat pocket, written out by Rowan that morning in her careful hand. 4 pages, specific, detailed, laying out the evidence in a sequence that would be clear to a federal marshal who'd been trying to build this case for 2 years without the pieces to do it. She'd watched him go without ceremony. He'd nodded to her, nodded to Gideon, and pointed his horse north. "He'll make it," Gideon said. "I know," she said. She turned the mare east. "Let's go find Thatch." Drayford was a half-day's ride, a settlement that existed mainly around a water source and a small cattle operation, the kind of place that appeared on some maps and not others. Virgil Thatch, according to what Reed had told them, lived on the edge of the settlement in a house he'd built himself on land he'd bought with what remained of the money he'd saved driving routes for Meridian transport before his conscience had caught up with him. They found the house without difficulty. It was the outermost structure of the settlement, set back from the road, with a vegetable garden at the side that was past its season and hadn't been fully cleared yet. A man was in the yard when they rode up, doing something with a fence post that had come loose, and he looked up at the sound of their horses with the particular alertness of someone who never quite stopped watching the road. Virgil Thatch was younger than Gideon had expected. Early 30s, lean, with the outdoor weathering that made men of that age look simultaneously younger and older depending on the light. He had a stillness to him that wasn't calm, exactly. It was the stillness of someone who'd learned to control his reactions because he'd been in situations where an uncontrolled reaction got people hurt. He recognized Reed's name immediately when Rowan said it. His expression didn't open exactly, but it unlocked slightly, the way a door does when the right key is used. "I've been wondering," he said, "if he was all right." "He's on his way to Weston County," Rowan said, "with 4 years of freight records and a letter for a federal marshal." Thatch looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon. Then he stood back from the fence and said, "You'd better come inside. Basitam." The inside of Thatch's house was clean and spare, the way someone's home gets when they've stripped it down to what they actually need and found a certain piece in the reduction. A table, 4 chairs, a good stove, shelves of provisions. A rifle above the door, which Gideon noted was both loaded and accessible, not a decoration. Thatch put coffee on and sat across the table from them and listened to the full account without interrupting. He had the quality of a good listener, not passive, but genuinely absorbing, with small adjustments in his attention that showed he was tracking the implications of each piece, not just the surface narrative. When Rowan had finished, he sat with it for a moment. "The Eastern Pass convoy," he said, "end of October." "You know the route?" "I drove it twice," he said, 2 years ago, before I left." His hands were flat on the table, and his face was doing something difficult that he was keeping controlled. "I drove it, and I didn't look in the wagons. I told myself that the routing was someone else's concern, that I was just a driver." A long pause. "I was told, we were all told, that the sealed wagons were specialty cargo, fragile goods, kept sealed to prevent damage. I believe some of the drivers actually believed that. He stopped. "I didn't ask questions. That's not the same as not knowing." "You left," Rowan said, 2 months after the second run. "I left, and I've spent a year and a half trying to figure out what leaving counts for." He looked at her directly. "Is this what it counts for?" "If you're willing," she said. He was quiet for a count of about 5 seconds. "Tell me what you need." "I need to know the route in detail. Every stop, every timing, the number of outriders they run with a large convoy, where the wagons separate if they do, where the most exposed section of the route is." She had a piece of paper on the table in front of her and a pencil. Everything. He told her everything. It took the better part of an hour, and as he talked, Gideon watched the map that was emerging under Rowan's hand. Not a professional map, but a working one. The kind that captured what mattered: distances, terrain features, the timing rhythms of a convoy that had run the same route enough times to have settled into patterns. The Eastern Pass route was a 2-day run from Mineral Fork to a distribution point in the Northern Territory called Harker's Flat, where the cargo was transferred to smaller, faster transports. 6 wagons, typically 8 to 12 outriders for a convoy this size, with a lead wagon carrying the Meridian transport foreman and 2 more armed men. The most exposed section was a 10-mile stretch through a narrow canyon east of a relay station called Dry Chalk, where the road was single track and there was no practical way to bring additional support in from outside. The convoy typically hit that section mid-morning on the second day. Mid-morning, second day, Gideon said, looking at the map. What's the relay station setup? Small, a water stop, a corral, room for 1 or 2 wagons to stage, staffed by 1 man, usually someone Blackthorn connected. So we can't use the station. No. Thatch traced a line on the map with his finger. But here, he tapped a point just before the canyon entrance. There's a flat shelf on the north face. You can see the road coming in for about half a mile, and the canyon entrance is a natural choke point. If the lead wagon stops, everything behind it stops. You're thinking about this like an ambush, Rowan said. I'm thinking about this like a man who drove that route twice and would have been very difficult to stop if someone had wanted to stop us, Thatch said. The weakness isn't the outriders. It's the wagons themselves. 6 wagons can't maneuver in a single-track canyon. They can only go forward or backward. Which means if the front and rear are simultaneously blocked, the convoy is stopped, he said. Whether they fight or not. Gideon looked at the map. We'd need people on both ends. Yes. How many outriders, realistically, are genuinely committed Blackthorn men versus hired hands? Rowan asked. Thatch considered. Of 12 outriders on a convoy this size, maybe 4 or 5 are core outfit men. The rest are hired guns. Mercenaries work a specific way. They're willing to fight when the odds favor it, when the odds shift badly. He shrugged. They're not dying for loyalty. So if the core men are neutralized quickly, Gideon said, the rest become a negotiation, Thatch said. Probably, Gideon said. I said I wasn't going to oversell it. Rowan had been looking at the map without speaking. Now she looked up. How many people can you bring? With a week to work with? I know 4 men in settlements within a day's ride who'd move on this, Thatch said. Former route drivers. Men who've had family touched by Blackthorn operations. 1 man who did 3 years' work for a Blackthorn-connected cattle operation and watched them run 2 neighbors off their land. He paused. They're not soldiers. Neither was Emmett Caldwell, Rowan said. Thatch looked at her. He was a 60-year-old depot agent who fought 3 Blackthorn men with a broom handle because it was the right thing to do, she said. I'm not asking for soldiers. I'm asking for people who are done looking the other way. Something in Thatch's face settled. Then I can bring 4. That's 7, Gideon said, with the 3 of us. 8, said a voice from the doorway. They all turned. A woman stood at the threshold, late 30s, heavy-set, with dark hair pulled back and an expression that had done its crying a long time ago and come out on the other side of it as something harder and more fixed. She was looking at Rowan specifically. My name is Clara Brent, she said. My daughter was on one of those wagons 3 years ago. Her name was Lily, and she was 14. She stepped inside without being invited, which seemed like a thing she'd decided before she opened the door. I heard you ride up. I've been listening from the other side of that wall for the last hour. She looked at Rowan steadily. Tell me what I have to do. There was no clean way to plan what they were planning, and Rowan didn't try to make it seem like there was. Over the next 2 days, at Thatch's house, the group came together in pieces. The 4 men Thatch had named arriving separately over the course of the first day, and then Clara Brent, who had already appointed herself a permanent fixture and was not going to be argued out of it by anyone with any sense of self-preservation. The 4 men were a former Meridian driver named Cole Aldridge, mid-40s, taciturn, with a burn scar on his forearm from a freight accident, and a son in Ridgeholme who'd been beaten badly by Blackthorn men for refusing to sign a protection arrangement. A rancher named Del Sousa, who'd been paying Blackthorn protection money for 2 years, and had watched 2 neighbors lose their land and wasn't going to wait for the same outcome. A young man called Nate Frey, barely 20, who had the serious, compressed quality of someone older than his years, whose older sister had disappeared from a Blackthorn-adjacent settlement the previous year, and a tall, quiet woman named Geneva Marsh, who had run a boarding house in a town the Blackthorn outfit had systematically bled dry over 3 years until she'd had to close and walk away with nothing. 8 people, all carrying something specific and personal. Not an army, not even close to an army, but people who had a reason in their bones, which Gideon had come to understand was different from hired courage. Rowan ran the planning with a directness that surprised some of them and didn't surprise Gideon at all. She put the map on the table and went through the convoy timing, the canyon terrain, the position assignments. She was honest about what could go wrong, which was a longer list than most people like to hear before an operation, but she worked through each one methodically. What they'd do if the outriders flanked instead of holding, what they'd do if the convoy changed timing, what the extraction route was for the people in the wagons once the convoy was stopped. "The girls in those wagons," she said at one point, and the table went very quiet. "When we open the wagons, they will be frightened. They will probably not know immediately that we're not more Blackthorn men. Some of them may fight, some may be in very poor condition." She looked around the table. "I need 2 people whose only job is the wagons, not the outriders, not the foreman, not the tactical situation. Just getting those wagons open and those people out safely. That is the entire purpose of this operation. Everything else is in service of that." She looked at Clara Brent. Clara looked back at her. "I'll take the wagons," Clara said. "Give me someone steady." Geneva Marsh raised her hand, not dramatically, just a practical gesture. "Good," Rowan said. The logistics were imperfect in the way that the logistics of improvised operations always are. They had enough firepower if nothing went wrong, and not quite enough if something did. They had one person with actual tactical experience, Thatch, who'd seen enough on his convoy runs to understand how these things moved, and 7 people who had determination and various degrees of competence with a rifle, which was not the same thing. Gideon didn't say any of this out loud, not because it wasn't true, but because it was already known, and there was no value in repeating it. What he did say, on the second evening, to Rowan alone, when the others had gone to their makeshift sleeping arrangements in Thatch's house and the barn, and he found her outside sitting on the fence rail looking north. "You don't have to lead this personally." She looked at him. "You could send the others. Thatch knows the route. Aldridge drove it. You could go to Weston County, make sure Reed and the marshal are moving, start the official process." "I know I could," she said. "Then, Gideon." She turned on the rail so she was facing him. "Those girls in those wagons. I was in a storage room for 3 days. 3 days. And I thought some very specific things about whether anyone was going to come for me." She held his eyes. "Emmett Caldwell came for me. And you came for me. And I am telling you right now that I am going to be one of the people who comes for them, because I know what it feels like to be in the dark, waiting to find out if anyone is going to." Her voice was completely even. "I'm not brave about it. I'm not doing it because I'm not afraid. I'm terrified. But I'm going." He didn't argue. "I know," he said. She turned back to looking north. The sky had gone full dark and the stars were thick and cold, and the land below them was just a shape. "We leave before dawn," she said. They rode out at 4 in the morning, 8 people on horseback moving east through the pre-dawn dark, the cold of deep October in their teeth and their breath fogging in front of them. The horses were steady. The road was dry after the rain, firmed up overnight, and the terrain opened gradually as they moved toward the pass country. Nobody talked much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't been said, and the specific silence of people moving toward something difficult had settled over the group in the way it does. Not oppressively, but as a kind of shared acknowledgement that they were past the planning stage and into the stage where all that remained was what they actually did. Cole Aldridge rode up alongside Gideon somewhere in the second hour and was quiet for a while before he said, "You think this works?" "I think it can work," Gideon said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Gideon said, "it's not." Aldridge absorbed this. "My boy," he said after a moment, "when those men beat him, he didn't do anything wrong. He just said no. He said he wasn't paying protection money to anyone, that it wasn't right, that he was going to report it." He paused. "They put him in the hospital for 6 weeks. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't talk much at all anymore." Another pause, shorter. He was the kind of kid who talked all the time before. Gideon didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would address that particular specific loss. He just kept writing. Aldridge kept writing too. Rowan was at the front of the group, and from behind her you could see the set of her shoulders and the steadiness of her seat on the mare, and nothing about her posture suggested a person who was turning around. She rode like someone who'd made a commitment several miles back and was now just executing it. The first gray light came up when they were half a day from the canyon, and the country around them changed character as the light increased. The shapes that had been suggestions became real terrain, rock and dry grass, and the occasional cedar holding its dark color against the yellowing landscape. And the road narrowed ahead of them, where the hill country reasserted itself. One day, until the convoy, Gideon checked the rifle across his saddle. Checked it again, not because he'd forgotten the first check, but because it was something his hands knew to do when everything else was out of his control. Up ahead, Rowan had slowed the mare slightly to let the group close up, and when Gideon came alongside her, she glanced at him once. Not for reassurance, he thought, but just to confirm he was there. A taking of inventory, making sure the pieces were still present and accounted for. He was there. The road ran east, and they ran with it, and the October morning came up cold and clear and indifferent around them, the way the frontier always was, neither promising nor threatening anything specific, just presenting the ground and letting the people on it decide what it meant. They reached the canyon approach with 12 hours to spare, which was what Rowan had planned for and still felt like barely enough time once they were standing in the actual terrain rather than looking at a hand-drawn map on a table. The shelf Thatch had described on the north face of the canyon entrance was real, and it was usable, but it was narrower than his memory had suggested. Room for 3 people prone with rifles, not 5, and the angle to the road below was steeper than ideal, which meant shooting down into the canyon floor was possible, but shooting at the rear of the convoy once it had passed the entrance would require repositioning. Gideon walked the shelf twice, measuring it with his boots, and didn't say anything, but Rowan watched him do it and understood what the silence meant. They adjusted. Thatch and Aldridge took the shelf, because they were the 2 best shots and because Thatch knew the convoy's movement patterns from the inside. Gideon repositioned to a rock formation 30 yards further into the canyon, on the south face, lower and closer to the road. A worse defensive position, but a better angle on the convoy's midsection once it was inside the walls. Del Sousa and Nate Frey took the rear blocking position, a quarter-mile deeper into the canyon where a natural debris fall had narrowed the track to almost nothing. Their job was simple and miserable: wait, and when the signal came, move their horses across the track and hold the rear. Clara Brent and Geneva Marsh staged in a shallow draw off the canyon mouth, close enough to move to the wagons quickly once the convoy was stopped and the outriders were neutralized or had decided that neutralized was the direction they preferred. That left Rowan at the front. "You're not a blocking position," Gideon told her, the evening before, when they were going through the final assignments by firelight in the draw, where they'd camped. "I'm the one they won't shoot immediately," she said. "A lone woman on a horse in the middle of a road causes hesitation. A man in the same position gets shot." "They'll recognize you," he said. "You have their brand. The men running that convoy—" "Might recognize me," she said, "or might not. There are hundreds of people on Blackthorn routes. I wasn't a priority target for every man in the organization, and if some of them do recognize me," she looked at him evenly, "that also causes hesitation. They'll want to take me alive. They have orders about that." The logic was sound, and Gideon hated it. "How long do you need to hold the front?" he asked. "Long enough for Thatch and Aldridge to take the outriders down from the shelf. Long enough for the lead wagon to stop and the ones behind it to close up." She looked at the map. 3 minutes, maybe 4. "A lot can happen in 4 minutes." "Yes," she said, "it can." He looked at her, and she looked back at him with that gray assessment he'd come to know as her default expression for situations she'd already thought through and wasn't going to be argued out of. He'd stopped trying to change her mind about things she'd thought through. It was a waste of both their time, and he respected her too much for it anyway. "All right," he said, 4 minutes." She nodded. Then, after a pause, "If something goes wrong with the front position, I'll come off the south face," he said. "Don't get yourself killed doing it." "I'll do my best," he said, which was honest and also the most he could promise her, and she seemed to accept it as such. They were in position before first light. The canyon in the pre-dawn was a cold, dark corridor, the rock walls holding the night's chill past the point where the open country had begun to warm, and the horses were quiet in their staging areas with the particular patience of animals that sensed something was happening and had made their peace with it. Gideon lay on his stomach on a ledge of the south face, his rifle across a flat rock, and watched the pale lightning of the canyon mouth to the east. Beside him was nothing except rock and the faint smell of cedar from a stunted tree growing out of a crack 10 feet below. He was far enough from the road that normal movement wouldn't catch him, but close enough that a man on horseback at the convoy's midsection would be clearly visible. He thought about his father's ranch, not in the deliberate way he sometimes allowed himself to think about it, turning the memory over like an object, but in the involuntary way that things from the past surface when a person is still and cold and waiting for something difficult. The fence posts his father had painted white the summer Gideon was 14 because his father had said a well-kept fence said something about a man's character, and Gideon had thought that was the kind of thing fathers said to fill up silence, and later he'd thought maybe it was just true. The blackthorn notice had been nailed to one of those white fence posts. He remembered the paint around the nail, chipped and raw. He heard the convoy before he saw it. Sound traveled strangely in canyon country, bouncing off rock walls, arriving before the source it belonged to. First the creak of wagon wheels, deep and rhythmic. Then the horse sounds, hooves on dry rock, the occasional snort, the particular percussion of multiple animals moving together, and then gradually the visual. The lead wagon rounding the canyon entrance with a mounted man on either side, and the Meridian transport foreman riding ahead on a dark horse. Gideon counted 11 outriders that he could see, possibly more with the rear wagons, which were not yet fully visible. The lead wagon came in, and then the second and the third, and the canyon was filling with the sound of the convoy, the way a closed room fills with noise, nowhere for it to go. Rowan was in the road 40 yards ahead. He didn't know exactly when she'd moved into position. She was simply there when he looked forward along the canyon, a lone figure on the brown mare, standing across the road's center with the stillness of someone who had made a decision and was finished negotiating with herself about it. Her hands were visible and empty, reins loose, and she sat the horse like she had all morning to be there. The convoy foreman saw her and raised one hand. The procession slowed, creaked, came to a gradual stop. The foreman was a heavy man on a dark horse wearing a tan coat, and he pulled up about 20 yards from Rowan with 2 outriders flanking him. At this distance, Gideon couldn't read the foreman's face, but he could read his posture, not immediately alarmed, which meant he was reading her as an obstacle rather than a threat. "Road's not closed," the foreman called. "Move aside." "I need a word with you," Rowan said. Her voice carried clean in the enclosed air of the canyon. "About what's in your wagons?" A pause. The foreman's posture changed slightly. One of the flanking outriders shifted his hand toward his coat. "You're blocking a commercial freight route," the foreman said. "I'll ask you once more." "My name is Rowan Hale," she said. "And I know you know that name, or some of you do, and I need you to understand right now that the decision you make in the next 60 seconds determines how this ends for you." Complete silence. Even the horses seemed to hold. And then one of the flanking riders said something to the foreman, fast and low, and the foreman's head came up, and his hand went to his sidearm, and from the shelf above the canyon entrance came the sharp, flat crack of Thatch's rifle. The outrider on the foreman's left went off his horse. Everything happened very fast after that. The second rifle shot from the shelf, Aldridge now, took out the right-hand outrider before he'd completed the draw. The foreman spun his horse toward the shelf and got halfway through shouting an order before Gideon fired from the south face, and the bullet cut the foreman's hat off his head, and the next one hit the road at his horse's feet, and the horse did what horses do when things hit the ground near their feet, which was panic and go sideways. And the foreman lost his pistol in the scramble to stay mounted. "Down off your horses," Gideon called from the south face, loud and clear. "All of you, hands where I can see them. There are 8 rifles on this canyon, and I have no interest in using more of them than necessary." There were not 8 rifles on the canyon. There were 4, but the arithmetic of an ambush worked on perception as much as reality, and the hired outriders in the midsection of the convoy, men who were paid to ride with freight and occasionally discourage trouble, not to die in a canyon for a company they had no loyalty to, were doing exactly what Thatch had predicted. They were calculating. 3 of them dismounted immediately, hands up. 2 more toward the rear held for a moment. Gideon could see them conferring, looking at the canyon walls, looking at their options. And then the sound of Del Sousa and Nate Frey moving horses across the track at the canyon's rear end made the decision for them. They dismounted. The 4 core Blackthorn men were a different matter. 2 of them had taken defensive positions behind the lead wagon, using its bulk as cover, and they were returning fire toward the shelf with a discipline that said they'd been in situations like this before. One of them had gotten to a good angle on the south face, and a bullet came off the rock 3 feet to Gideon's left, with a sound like a hammer on steel, and he dropped lower and repositioned fast, scraping his elbow raw on the rock, not thinking about it, already looking for the new angle. The third Blackthorn man had grabbed Rowan. He'd come off one of the middle wagons while the attention was on the lead wagon's position, moved fast through the confusion of dismounting outriders, and he had her from behind with one arm and a pistol at the side of her head. And he was using her as a screen, backing toward the canyon wall with his face half hidden behind her hat. Gideon saw it. He went completely still. The man was saying something, shouting it, really, at the canyon walls, at the general presence of rifles he couldn't see, and the specific words didn't matter because the message was clear enough. He had leverage, and he intended to use it. From the shelf, Gideon saw Thatch's rifle shift, saw him calculating the angle, saw him decide it wasn't there, not at this distance with the movement, and pull back. Rowan was not panicking. He could see that from 40 yards away. Her body was tense, not rigid. She was thinking, assessing, doing the same calculation she always did, and her hands were at her sides and not fighting the grip because fighting a grip from behind is how people get shot accidentally, and she knew that. The man's pistol was pressed hard at the side of her head. Gideon put his rifle down. He stood up from the south-face ledge, fully visible, and stepped down to the canyon floor and walked toward the man holding Rowan with his hands out from his sides. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice even. The man's attention swung to him. The pistol didn't move from Rowan's head. "You've got two choices," Gideon said, walking. "Not fast, not slow. You let her go, and you put your hands up, and this ends with you alive. Or you don't. And the men on that shelf put a bullet in you the second there's a clear angle, and this ends the other way." "Stay back," the man said. "I'm just talking," Gideon said. He stopped about 10 yards away. "Those other two men behind the lead wagon, they're good at what they do, but they're 2 men against 4 rifles, and they're going to run out of the math eventually. You know that." He kept his eyes on the man's face. "There's nothing about this situation that improves for you. Not one part of it." The man's eyes were moving, to Gideon, to the canyon walls, to the shelf he couldn't see anymore. He was doing the calculation Gideon was describing, and the calculation wasn't coming out in his favor, and he knew it, and the knowledge was making him unpredictable, which was the most dangerous version of this problem. "I'll kill her," he said. "I know you might," Gideon said. "I'm asking you not to." A beat of silence. The canyon held the sounds of the 2 Blackthorn men behind the lead wagon, reduced now to occasional shots without clear targets, and the horses moving restlessly, and nothing else. "My name is Gideon Vance," he said. "My father had a ranch. About 20 years ago. Maybe you weren't even in this organization then, I don't know. Blackthorn men burned his barn and killed 2 of his workers and sent him a notice with 3 days to sign over his water rights. He signed. It didn't matter. He was dead 2 years later anyway." He held the man's eyes. "I'm not telling you that to threaten you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I'm not standing here because it's easy for me, or because I'm not afraid, or because I don't know what people in your outfit are capable of." He paused. "I'm standing here because someone has to, and I'm the one who's here." Something in the man's face shifted. Not softening, nothing so simple. Just a slight recalibration, the way a man's expression changes when he understands that the person in front of him is serious. And in that moment of recalibration, Rowan moved. She dropped her weight straight down, not sideways, not backward, just down, collapsing her knees so the arm across her chest caught air instead of her body, and she turned inward toward the man's gun arm rather than away from it, which was counterintuitive and exactly right, and her elbow came up hard into his ribs on the way. The pistol fired. The shot went into the canyon wall 6 feet to the left of where she'd been standing. Gideon was already moving. He covered the 10 yards fast and hit the man while he was still disoriented from the elbow, and they went down together in the dirt and rock of the canyon floor. And it was not a clean or efficient thing. The man was large and still had the pistol, and the pistol came up between them, and Gideon got both hands on the wrist and held it away from anything vital while they struggled in the loose rock. And it cost him a fist across the jaw that made his vision white out for a second, and another one to the ribs, and he kept hold of the wrist and didn't let go. And then Cole Aldridge was there, stepping hard on the man's gun hand from above, and the pistol came free. It was over. The 2 men behind the lead wagon lasted another 4 minutes. One of them took a shot from the shelf that hit his shoulder, and the other one, watching this, came out with his hands up and the calculation plain on his face. The first one followed, holding his shoulder, swearing steadily. Quiet settled into the canyon. The particular strange quiet of a place that had been very loud and was now very still. Gideon sat up in the dirt and put his hand to his jaw, which was going to swell substantially, and looked across the canyon floor to where Rowan was already on her feet, checking her hands against each other as if to confirm they were both still functional, and he thought, of course she's already on her feet. "You all right?" he called. She looked at him. "Your face," she said. "I know. That's going to be bad tomorrow." "I know," he said. She almost smiled. The almost was enough.
She almost said.
The wagons were worse than they'd prepared for, which Gideon supposed was not surprising. You could prepare for a number of, and you could not prepare for the reality of opening a sealed wagon door in a canyon and seeing what was inside. Clara Brent opened the first one. She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the latch and her back to everyone else, and then she opened it and went inside without saying anything, and Geneva Marsh went in after her, and the rest of them kept their positions with the disarmed outriders and didn't crowd toward the wagons, because Rowan had been specific about that. They need women first, she'd said in the planning, not a crowd of strangers. 17 girls, between 12 and 19 years of age, from what could be estimated. Some of them couldn't stand without help. Two of them, when Clara Brent spoke to them through the open door, didn't respond to words at all. They responded to tone, eventually, and to stillness, the way animals respond to the absence of threat before they can process the presence of safety. Rowan went to the wagons after Clara and Geneva had been inside for 10 minutes, and she stayed there for a long time. Gideon kept watch on the disarmed men and listened to Nate Frey asking quiet questions of one of the hired outriders, gathering information, names, dates, the kind of details a federal investigation would need, and Del Sousa and Thatch secured the Blackthorn men with the rope from the lead wagon's supply box. The foreman had recovered his composure, if not his horse, and he was sitting on the ground with his wrists bound and his expression set in the particular way of a man who understood he'd lost a round and was already calculating the next one. "You know what you've done," he said, when Gideon came to stand over him. "Yes," Gideon said. "This isn't over because you stopped one convoy." "No," Gideon agreed. "But a federal investigation in Weston County that opened 3 days ago, that's a different conversation." The foreman went still. "That look," Gideon said, "tells me you know what I'm talking about, which tells me the organization knows and hasn't been able to stop it." He looked down at the man. "Evidence from 2 independent source sets, testimony from multiple witnesses, submitted to a marshal with federal authorization. That's already moving." He crouched to the foreman's level. "The convoy was never the main event. You understand that? The convoy was us getting these girls out while the real work happened somewhere else." The foreman said nothing. "Tell whoever sends someone after us," Gideon said, standing back up, "that the records are already with the federal authority. Destroying us doesn't destroy the records. It just makes the investigation more urgent." He walked away from the foreman without waiting for a response. The aftermath was long and imperfect, the way aftermaths always are. Getting 17 girls out of a canyon on horses and wagon transport, with one road in and one road out, was a logistics problem that took the better part of the afternoon, and several of the outriders, the hired ones, not the Blackthorn Corps, ended up helping with it. Whether from guilt or self-interest or simple humanity was not something Gideon interrogated too carefully. The help was needed, and it was given, and that was enough. They used 3 of the Meridian wagons, driven by Thatch and Aldridge and Del Sousa, heading west toward Drayford, where Thatch had already arranged, during the planning days, for the settlement's boarding house to receive people who needed medical attention and somewhere safe. Clara Brent rode in the back of the first wagon and talked to the girls for the entire journey, not about what had happened to them, but about ordinary things. Her house, the settlement she'd come from, a recipe for cornbread that she claimed was the only reason worth stopping in Drayford. Her voice was steady the whole way. Gideon rode alongside the first wagon and watched her do it, and thought about the specific courage of that. Not the canyon courage, not the rifle courage, but the courage of talking to frightened people about cornbread in a steady voice for 3 hours because it was what they needed. Rowan rode ahead, and didn't look back. He came alongside her once in the middle stretch between the canyon and Drayford, where the road was wide enough for 2 horses, and the country around them had gone orange and gold in the late afternoon light. "You're thinking about Cass," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't deny it. "He should have been here to see this," she said. Her voice was even, but it cost her something. "He'd have been here if he could have been," Gideon said. "I know that." She was quiet for a moment. "Doesn't make it easier. It just makes it true." They rode side by side, and the light came down through the dry October air at the angle that makes everything look briefly golden, the kind of light that doesn't last. And Gideon thought about his father again. Not the burning barn, not the signed deed, but earlier, before all of that, when the ranch had been a going concern, and his father had been a man who painted fence posts white because he believed it said something about a man's character. It said something. He still believed that. "The Blackthorn leadership," Rowan said after a long silence. "The 3 men Cass heard named. The federal investigation will move toward them eventually. But eventually is a long time if they're destroying evidence and relocating people while the investigation finds its footing." "You're thinking about getting there first," Gideon said. "I'm thinking about the fact that the investigation needs those men to stay findable," she said. "Needs them to stay in position long enough to be caught by it. If they run, then we make sure they don't run," Gideon said. She glanced at him. "That's easier to say than to do." "Most things are." She looked at the road ahead. Her jaw was set, and her posture was the forward-facing thing it always was. And he knew she was already planning the next piece. Had probably been planning it since the canyon. Had probably been planning it since before they'd arrived at the canyon, the way she always was. Always 3 steps ahead of the current situation, always looking at the next problem while the current one was still resolving. It was also, he had come to understand, how she processed pain, by having something to move toward. He didn't say that, because she didn't need him to observe it. She knew it about herself. "The 3 men," he said instead. "The names Cass overheard. Do you know where they are?" "2 of them," she said. "The 3rd I've had to guess at, based on the organizational structure in the records. But I have enough to start." "And the plan?" She was quiet for a moment, and he waited, because he'd learned that her quiet was working quiet, not empty quiet. "We go to Weston County first," she said. "We make sure Reed and the marshal have what they need. We give our own testimony." She paused. "And then I go to where the Blackthorn leadership is." "We go," he said. She looked at him again. "We've been over this," she said. You don't have to." "Rowan," he said. He said her name the way she'd said his, in the canyon, level and flat and final. "We've been over this." She held his look for a moment. Something in her face did a complicated thing that he'd learned to read as her accepting something she'd been prepared to argue against. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was the acknowledgement of a person who has been operating alone for a long time, in the specific way that people who've had to be self-sufficient develop a reflex against relying on anything that could be taken away, recognizing that there was something in front of her that wasn't going to be taken away. "All right," she said. The wagons rolled behind them, and the light continued its slow gold descent, and Drayford appeared as a scatter of structures on the flat land ahead, smoke rising from chimneys, the particular domestic smoke of a settlement preparing for evening. Nate Frey pulled his horse up beside Gideon and said quietly, "That outrider I talked to, the hired one, at the rear of the convoy. He gave me names, 7 names of men in the Blackthorn organization above the convoy level. He had a folded paper in his hand. I wrote them down." Gideon took the paper, looked at it. 3 of the names on it were names he recognized. 2 from Reed's annotated manifests. 1 from the pages Cass Hale had copied and hidden in his sister's saddlebag lining. The 3rd name on the list, a name the outrider had mentioned as the man who issued direct orders for the Eastern Territory's operations, was a name Gideon did not recognize, but it was a name that appeared in Cass's copied records with a double line in the margin. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket. The settlement of Drayford came up around them as they rode in. People emerging from doorways, the boarding house doors already open as arranged, the smell of wood smoke and cooking coming out into the cold evening air. Thatch had slowed the first wagon to a stop, and Clara Brent was already at the door, speaking to whoever was inside, her voice carrying its same steady quality as if the last 6 hours had been an ordinary afternoon. Geneva Marsh dismounted and stretched her back, which had been stiff since the canyon, and said to no one in particular, "That's done then." "Part of it," Rowan said, swinging down from the mare. "Always with her," Geneva said to Gideon, with a tired half-smile that contained about a decade of weariness and something else underneath it that might have been the specific satisfaction of a person who had done something that mattered. Gideon looked at Rowan, who was already moving toward the boarding house entrance, already organizing the next thing. Her hat was crooked, and she had canyon dust on her coat, and the swelling on her jaw from the trading post had finally mostly faded, but her knuckles were scraped raw from the canyon floor, and none of it slowed her down by a single step. He pocketed the folded list of names and followed her inside. The boarding house in Drayford held them for 2 nights, which was 2 nights longer than Rowan wanted and exactly as long as it needed to be. The girls from the wagons required attention that couldn't be rushed. A local woman who had done midwifery work and enough general medicine to be the closest thing the settlement had to a doctor came and stayed through the first night, and Clara Brent didn't leave the building at all during that time, sleeping in a chair in the hallway between the 2 rooms where the girls were housed. Gideon sat on the boarding house porch on the second evening and listened to the settlement settle into night and thought about the folded list of names in his coat pocket and the distance to Weston County and the specific weight of what came next. Nate Frey sat with him for a while, not talking much. The young man had a quality of contained energy that had found some outlet in the canyon and hadn't quite resettled yet. He was turning something over in his hands, a small piece of leather cord, tying and untying a knot. "My sister," he said eventually. "I know," Gideon said. "She's not going to be in one of those wagons. I know that. I've known it." He kept working the cord. "But I keep thinking, somebody stopped this convoy. Somebody should have stopped one before." Gideon didn't argue the point because it was true. "That's why we do it now," he said. "Not because it fixes what didn't get done, just because now is what we have." Frey tied the knot one final time and held it. "That's not very comforting." "No," Gideon said. "It's not." They sat with that for a while, and the stars came out thick and cold overhead. And somewhere inside the boarding house, Clara Brent was talking in that steady voice of hers, and the sound of it carried faintly through the wall like something being carefully held together. Sat. Rowan found Gideon in the boarding house stable the next morning while he was checking Calder's shoes before the Weston County ride. She came in without announcing herself, which was how she always came into spaces, and stood at the stall door and watched him work for a moment. "Reed sent word," she said. "I had Thatch send a rider to Weston County 2 days ago with a message asking for confirmation. The rider came back this morning." She leaned against the stall door. "The marshal opened a formal investigation 4 days ago. Reed's testimony is on record. Federal authorization to subpoena Blackthorn-connected accounts and freight records across 3 counties. Gideon straightened up. "That's it." "That's the beginning of it," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "You're not going to let yourself feel it, are you?" She opened her mouth and then closed it, which was unusual for her. "I'll feel it when it's done," she said finally. "When is it done? For you?" She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he let it sit rather than filling it. "When the 3 men at the top of it are in custody or destroyed," she said. "When they can't give orders anymore. When the organization can't reconstitute around new leadership because the evidence base is too comprehensive and the federal process is too far along." She said it flatly, not dramatically. "That's when it's done." "That could take months," he said, "even with the investigation running." "I know." She looked at the stable floor. "I've been fighting this for 18 months. I can fight it for 18 more if I have to." He finished checking the shoe and stood up fully and looked at her across the stall. She was thinner than she'd been when he'd found her, which seemed wrong but was probably just the result of weeks of hard riding and irregular meals and the specific expenditure of being at a state of high alert for months at a stretch. Her eyes had that permanent quality of watchfulness that he suspected she'd had for so long she no longer noticed it. And her coat was still dusted at the hem from the canyon floor 2 days ago, and she was standing at his stable door at 6 in the morning to tell him news about a federal investigation, and she looked like she hadn't slept particularly well and didn't expect to, and Gideon looked at all of this and thought about all the ways this was not a simple situation and all the ways it also very much was. "We'll take the direct road to Weston County," he said. 2 days if we push." She nodded. Then she said, "The 3 names from Nate's list. The ones I've been tracking. I have locations on 2 of them. She pulled a folded paper from her coat and held it out to him. The third one, the operational director for the Eastern Territories. I didn't have a physical location, but look at the bottom of that page. He took the paper and unfolded it. At the bottom, in her handwriting, was an address, a specific address, in a town. Where did this come from? He asked. The foreman, she said. From the canyon. He's been in Thatch's barn for 2 days, and I went and had a conversation with him last night. Her expression was neutral. I told him about the federal investigation. I told him what was already on record. I told him that the investigation would reach him eventually, that there was no version of this where he wasn't identified and charged, because Reed's records and Cass's records together covered 4 years of operations in his territory, and his name appeared in them 6 times. She paused. And I told him that the difference between how his situation resolved depended largely on whether he cooperated with the federal process or didn't. He gave you the address. He gave me several things, she said. The address was one of them. Gideon refolded the paper. You should have told me you were going. I know, she said without apology. I needed to do it myself, without another person in the room. She held his look. Some things I have to be the one who does them. He understood that because it was true of things in his own life too. All right, he said. He'll cooperate with the federal marshal, she said, when they come for him. I believe that. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Because when I told him what was in those records, what Cass had documented, what Reed had documented, the specifics of what moved through that convoy route, his face did something. She looked at the stable wall. I don't know if he'd stopped thinking about what it actually was, what the work he was doing actually was. Some people do that. They manage their own conscience by staying at the operational level and not looking down at what the operations produce. She paused. He looked, and then he talked. Gideon thought about that for a moment, about the specific mechanism by which people stay inside things they know are wrong, and the specific mechanism by which they sometimes stop. Let's go to Weston County, he said. The ride to Weston County took 2.5 days because the weather came back on the second afternoon. A proper storm this time, not the dithering rain of the hill country, but a hard-driving October storm with wind that cut sideways and made the horses reluctant and turned the road to something that was more suggestion than surface. They sheltered for 4 hours under a rock overhang, eating cold provisions from their saddlebags. And the storm passed, and they rode the last stretch into the county seat in the gray, washed-out calm that follows hard weather. Weston County's seat was a real town, a courthouse, a hotel with more than 4 rooms, a main street with businesses that had glass in their windows. The federal marshal's office was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, and they went there directly, still road damp, still carrying the smell of the storm. The marshal's name was Harlan Croft. He was 50 years old and built like a man who had spent a working life carrying weight, and he had the particular manner of someone who had spent 20 years in federal law enforcement. Not the theatrical authority that small-town lawmen sometimes adopted, but the flat, permanent competence of a person who had done the work long enough that the performance had been completely stripped away and only the substance remained. He knew who Rowan was before she introduced herself. He'd read Reed's testimony and Cass's records and her letter, and when she walked into his office, he looked at her with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, but a kind of careful recognition. The look of a man who has been building a case for 2 years and has just seen the person who handed him the pieces he'd been missing. Sit down, he said. Both of you. They sat. Your letter described 3 individuals at the Blackthorn leadership level, he said. By name, with an account of how those names were obtained. Yes, she said. The names match 3 individuals I've had circumstantial association with Blackthorn operations for 18 months without being able to place directly in the command structure, Croft said. He laid a hand on a file on his desk, thick with papers. What Reed gave me puts them in the structure. What your brother documented puts them to specific operations. The testimony from the convoy outriders... He paused. How many are willing to make formal statements? 4 of the 8 hired riders, Gideon said. Possibly a 5th, the one Nate Frey spoke with at length. Frey can get them to you. I need them here within 2 weeks, Croft said, before Blackthorn's organization understands the full scope of what we have and starts moving its principles. The Eastern Territory Operational Director, Rowan said. She put the folded paper on Croft's desk. That address was given to me by the convoy foreman in exchange for consideration during the federal process. He's willing to make a formal statement. Croft looked at the paper. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The slight shift of a man whose calculation has just improved materially. The other two principles, he said. Rowan put 2 more pages on his desk. The locations she'd described to Gideon in the stable. Addresses, names, the organizational roles as she understood them from everything Cass had gathered and everything she'd assembled in 18 months of running and thinking and keeping herself alive. Croft looked at each page. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Hale," he said, "I want to be direct with you about something." "Please," she said. "What you've built here, the evidentiary chain, the witness network, the documentation, this is more than my office has been able to assemble in 2 years with federal resources." He said it without embarrassment, just as a fact. "The investigation I've opened has federal authorization to proceed across 3 counties. With what you've given me, I can go to my superior this week and make the case for expanding that authorization." He leaned forward slightly. "But I need you to understand that the process from here moves at the speed of federal law, not at the speed of one person on a horse." "I understand that," she said. "Do you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because what I'm asking you to do is step back from this. Give me what you have, give us what you know, and let the legal process carry it forward. I'm asking that because if you go after these men independently, if anything happens to them or near them that can be tied to you, it complicates prosecution. It gives defense attorneys something to work with." The room was quiet. Rowan sat with this. Gideon watched her sit with it, and he could see the effort it required. Not the logical part, which she'd understood before they walked in the door, but the other part. The part of her that had been moving toward these men for 18 months, that had built the whole architecture of her purpose around reaching them, being asked to stop at the threshold and hand the forward motion to someone else. "The girls from the convoy," she said finally, "they need documentation of their situations for any legal protection. Some of them need to be connected with family, and some of them don't have family to connect with, and there are federal provisions for victims of trafficking," Croft said. "I can initiate that process. I'll need a contact at the settlement where they're currently housed." "Clara Brent," Gideon said, "in Drayford. She'll work with you." Croft wrote the name down. He wrote it carefully, which told Gideon something about how he approached his work. Rowan was looking at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up. "If the 3 principals attempt to leave the territory before your authorization expands, I have 2 deputies I can position within 48 hours, Croft said. "Discreetly, to monitor the locations you've given me." He held her gaze. "Miss Hale, I am going to finish this. I have been trying to build the case to finish this for 2 years. I give you my word that the investigation will not stop and will not be bought and will not be made to disappear." He paused. "Because I also have something personal in this." She waited. "There was a freight route running through this county 3 years ago," he said, "a Meridian transport route. My niece was 12 years old." He said it without asking for anything in return. No sympathy, no acknowledgement, just placing it on the table as the thing it was. "I've been working this case for 2 years for professional reasons, and one reason that isn't professional at all." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. "I'm sorry," Rowan said. 2 words, simply. "So am I," he said, "which is why this ends properly." They stayed in Weston County for 4 days, giving formal testimony. Gideon gave his account of the canyon convoy in the careful, specific language that Croft's deputy transcribed by hand, and he gave the account of the Caldwell Creek trading post, and he gave the history of his father's ranch, and the blackthorn notice on the fence post, not because it was legally relevant, but because Croft wanted the pattern documented, wanted the full span of how long this organization had been operating and what it had cost ordinary people over ordinary years. Rowan's testimony took 2 full days. She gave it without flinching and without embellishment and without once, as far as Gideon could tell, letting the emotional content of what she was describing change the precision with which she described it. She talked about Cass. She talked about the tracking, the capture, The storage room at Caldwell Creek. She talked about every piece of evidence and how it had been obtained and where it was and what it showed. She talked about the convoy. At one point, late in the second day, Croft's deputy had to stop transcribing and step out of the room for a few minutes. He came back composed, sat down, and picked up his pen without explaining the interruption, and Croft didn't ask him to explain it. On the third evening, Gideon sat in the hotel room and looked at the ceiling and felt the specific exhaustion of having put something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. Not relief, not closure. Those words were too clean for what it actually was. More like the feeling of a wound that's been cleaned out. Worse immediately, because now you could feel the actual extent of the damage, but necessary. Moving in the right direction. He thought about his father painting those fence posts white, about the care that went into a thing like that. The belief that the way you kept your property said something about your character, that it mattered even when it was just fence posts on a piece of land that nobody influential would ever see. He thought about what it had cost his father to sign that deed. Not just the land, the belief itself, the belief that what you built and how you maintained it meant something, that the world operated according to some principle of reasonable return on decency. His father had been wrong about that principle. The world didn't operate that way, not reliably, not in any way you could count on. But the impulse behind the white fence posts wasn't wrong. It was just aimed at a smaller target than it should have been aimed at. Rowan knocked on the door and came in without waiting for an answer, which was consistent. She sat on the edge of the chair by the window and looked at him, looking at the ceiling. "You're thinking about him," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "You get a specific look," she said it matter-of-factly. "Not sad exactly, just somewhere else." He sat up. "What about you? What are you thinking about?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about the fact that I don't know what I do next," she said. "I've been going towards something for 18 months. Every decision I made was oriented around a direction, and now—" She stopped. "The direction is handed off. The direction belongs to Croft in federal jurisdiction and a process I'm not running." She looked out the window at the Weston County street, the lamplit evening, ordinary commerce continuing. "I don't know what I look like when I'm not running towards something." "You look like a person," Gideon said. She glanced at him. "That's not nothing," he said. "After 18 months of being a target and a fugitive and a weapon, just being a person." He paused. "It might take some getting used to." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away, which was the Rowan Hale version of being moved by something. She didn't look at it directly. She looked adjacent to it and let it be there. "Cass would have had something to say about this," she said. "Something with a bird migration reference, probably." He had a way of applying natural history to human situations that was either profound or ridiculous, depending on your tolerance. A pause, and her voice was different on those sentences. Softer at the edges, without being weak. "I keep turning around to tell him things." "That doesn't go away," Gideon said. "I don't think it's supposed to." "No," she said. "I don't think so either." The federal warrants were issued on a Thursday morning, 6 days after Rowan and Gideon arrived in Weston County. Croft's expanded authorization had come through in 3 days, which was fast for federal process, and which Croft attributed to the quality of the evidentiary submission and to the fact that his federal superior had also apparently been watching Blackthorn's operations with frustration and insufficient grounds to act. 3 arrest teams, 3 simultaneous operations, timed to prevent communication between the principals. Croft coordinated it from his office with the specific, contained intensity of someone who had been waiting for the exact moment they were now in. Rowan and Gideon were not part of the arrest teams. Croft had been clear about that, and they had agreed to it, and agreeing to it was the right call, and also not easy. They waited in the courthouse. Rowan sat in a chair in the hallway outside Croft's office and didn't read the newspaper someone had left on the bench beside her and didn't pace and didn't do anything except sit with her hands in her lap and wait. Gideon sat beside her and did the same. The courthouse had the particular institutional quiet of a building where consequential things happened at a pace that the building itself had absorbed and no longer found remarkable. At 2 p.m, a deputy came through the main doors and went directly to Croft's office. He knocked, went inside, came back out 3 minutes later without expression. Another hour. Then Croft himself appeared in the hallway doorway and looked at them. "All 3, he said. Rowan stood up. "One of them attempted to run," Croft said. Got 2 miles before my deputy caught him. The other two were in the locations you identified. No one was injured. He looked at her directly. It's done. The hallway was quiet. The courthouse building went about its institutional business. Somewhere outside, a wagon passed on the street. Rowan stood very still for a moment. Gideon watched her absorb it, the specific process of taking in the thing she'd been moving toward for so long. He expected something visible, relief, collapse, tears, something. What he got was this. She sat back down. Slowly, like her legs had made the decision without consulting the rest of her. She sat in the chair and put her face in her hands, not crying, just holding it. The weight of 18 months of forward motion arriving all at once as stillness. He sat back down beside her and didn't say anything. After a while, she took her hands away from her face. Her eyes were dry, and her expression was the expression of someone who has come out the other side of something and is taking stock of what the other side looks like. Cass, she said, to no particular address. Just his name. Just the fact of him. He's why it happened, Gideon said. What he documented, the risk he took to document it. None of the rest of this builds without that. She nodded slowly. He'd have hated that he wasn't here for it, she said. He'd have wanted to see it. I know. And he'd have made a bird reference, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she pressed her mouth flat for a moment, and then she exhaled. Gideon did something he didn't plan in advance, which was to reach over and cover her hand with his, briefly. Just a second, just the contact of one person acknowledging another person's weight. Then he took it away. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, for all of it, for not... She stopped, reconsidered her words. For treating me like a person who could handle the truth of things. People either try to protect me from reality, or they're indifferent to it. You did neither. You made it easy, he said. You didn't ask to be protected from it. Most people think I should have. She looked at her hands. I don't want to be the kind of person who needs to be protected from the truth, even when the truth is hard. The truth is usually hard, he said. That doesn't mean you shouldn't know it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness that was her most consistent quality, What do you do now, after this? He thought about it honestly. I don't know exactly, he said. I've been working other men's cattle for 12 years. I know how to do that. He paused. But I've also been carrying something for 12 years that I've been setting down over the last few weeks, and I find I'm interested in what I'm like without it. She looked at him. What do you think you're like? I think I'm like someone who might want to own land again, he said. Eventually. Something small. Something with good water. She almost smiled. That sounds specific. There's a county 3 days west of here, he said. Good grazing, water rights that aren't contested, settlement that's growing but not yet expensive. He looked at her. I had time to notice things while I was riding around the frontier. You did, she said. The conversation had a different quality now than it had ever had. Not the planning quality, not the operational quality, not the two people moving toward a dangerous thing quality. Something that was just conversation. Two people in a courthouse hallway in the late afternoon talking about land and water rights and what came next. There's work to do still, she said. The girls from the convoy need advocates. Reed needs legal protection through the trial process. The testimony network, the other witnesses Thatch identified, they need someone coordinating them, making sure they're protected and prepared. She paused. Croft can't do all of it. The federal process is the spine, but it needs support around it. You're going to do that, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm the one who knows where all the pieces are, she said. I'm the one who built the connections. It makes sense for me to... She stopped, reconsidered. It makes sense, and also I need something to do. I'm not good at nothing. Nobody's good at nothing, he said. The people who seem like they are have just found a way to dress it up. She looked at him. Is that what the 3 days west of here is? A way to dress it up? No, he said. That's a thing I actually want. He held her look. You could come and look at it, he said, when the immediate work is settled, when the trial process is moving and Reed is situated and the girls have what they need. He said it simply. Not a plan, just you could look at it. She held his gaze for a moment.
Something in her face did the complicated thing, the adjacent to being moved thing, and then she looked at the courthouse hallway ceiling with the expression of someone taking a full breath for the first time in a while. "All right," she said. "I could look at it."
The Blackthorn trials began in the spring. 3 principals charged under federal jurisdiction with charges that covered trafficking, fraud, coercion, conspiracy to murder, and a list of subsidiary offenses that ran to 7 pages of the official indictment. The evidentiary record was, as Croft had told his federal superior in his authorization request, comprehensive in a way that left very little practical room for the defense. It took time. It took 8 months of preparation and 2 months of proceedings, and the testimony of 41 witnesses, including Reed and 4 of the convoy outriders, and a woman named Clara Brent, who took the stand and spoke for 3 hours in a voice that didn't waver once and said everything that needed to be said about what happened to girls in sealed wagons on freight routes through the hill country. Rowan testified for 4 days. She was precise and she was thorough, and she didn't perform grief or anger or victimhood, and the defense attorneys who tried to rattle her found, one after another, that she had a quality of absolute groundedness that made rattling her technically impossible. She knew what she knew. She had documented what she'd documented. She spoke clearly and she didn't embellish and she didn't back down. Gideon sat in the gallery for her testimony. She knew he was there, and she didn't look at him once during the 4 days, because looking at the gallery was not useful, and Rowan Hale did not do things that weren't useful when useful things needed doing. But when she came out of the courthouse on the 4th afternoon and he was on the steps, she stopped beside him and stood there for a moment. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. They stood on the courthouse steps in the spring light, which was warm after the long winter, and the street below them was ordinary, horses and wagons, and people going about their business in the way of people who didn't know that the thing that had been built against them for 20 years was currently being dismantled in the building behind them. Most people never know about the things that could have happened to them and didn't, because someone else made a hard choice in the right direction. That's not ingratitude. It's just how it works. The people who make the choices don't do it for the recognition anyway, not the real ones. They do it because they reach a point where not doing it costs more than doing it, and because someone, sometimes a stranger in a storage room, sometimes a depot agent keeping records in a floor, sometimes a convoy driver who looked in a wagon and couldn't unknow what he saw, decides that knowing about a wrong thing and doing nothing about it is its own kind of participation. Cass Hale had understood that. He'd documented it and mailed it to his sister and gotten on a road to a federal marshal, and he hadn't made it. That was the fact of it, the hard, unbearable fact, and nothing that came after changed it. But what he'd started had continued, because the things you put in motion don't stop just because you do. The verdicts came in on a Tuesday morning in late spring. All 3 principals, guilty on all primary counts. The judge's sentencing was thorough and unsentimental and left no practical path back to freedom for any of them. Rowan was not in the courtroom when the verdicts were read. She was in Drayford, helping Clara Brent with the ongoing work of connecting the girls from the convoy with legal advocates and social services, and in several cases with families who had spent months not knowing where their daughters were. She heard about the verdicts from a rider that Croft sent, and she read the message twice and then folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket with the same care she'd once used to fold Cass's copied records. She finished what she was doing, which was helping a 15-year-old girl named Marie practice writing her own name on a piece of paper, because Marie had learned to read late and was embarrassed about her handwriting, and Rowan had been sitting with her for an hour, just steady and patient, saying it didn't matter how it looked as long as it was legible, and that legible was enough. Marie wrote her name. It was legible. "There," Rowan said. "That's yours." She rode west 3 weeks later. The county Gideon had described was 3 days west of Weston County, and the land was what he'd said it was. Good grazing, a creek running clear over flat stone, a ridge to the north that broke the worst of the winter wind. He'd acquired a modest piece of it, not large, the kind of operation that a single person could run with one hired hand and some honest effort, and he'd been building a fence line along the eastern boundary, which she arrived in the middle of. He was on the 4th post when she came over the ridge. He stopped working and watched her come down the slope on the brown mare with the white sock. She'd kept that horse, and the horse had developed the steady, unhurried quality of an animal that had been well cared for through difficult country. And she rode up to the fence line and stopped and looked at what he'd built so far. It's straight, she said. I'm trying, he said. She looked at the land, the creek visible in the low ground, the ridge behind them, the sky doing something complicated with light in the west where the sun was getting low. She looked at it the way she looked at problems, thoroughly, taking inventory. The water rights, she said? Clear, he said. Registered with the county office. Not contested. What's the east boundary situation? Neighboring property, decent man, no disputes. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him, and the gray assessment that was always in her eyes was there. But there was something else alongside it now that had been building for months and had not quite been named yet. Not sentiment exactly, not the soft focus version of feeling that stories usually reach for at their endings, but something more like the specific warmth of two people who have moved through difficult country together and have found, at the other end of it, that they still want to be in the same place. You'll need more fence posts, she said. I know, he said. I can help with that, she said. For a while, until I figure out the next thing. I know, he said. She swung down from the mare and tied the horse to the fence line she'd just been evaluating and came around to where he was standing with the post and the tamping tool, and she held out her hand for the tamping tool with the complete naturalness of a person who sees work that needs doing and intends to do it. He handed it over. They worked until the light was gone, and the fence line got 3 posts further east, and neither of them said very much because there wasn't much that needed saying. And the creek ran clear over its flat stones and the low ground, and the ridge held against the sky in the last light, and the land was quiet. In the way that land is quiet, when the people on it have stopped running and started building. There is a thing that happens sometimes, to people who have survived the worst version of what was meant for them. They come out of it changed in ways they can't fully explain, carrying something that looks like damage from the outside but is actually just knowledge. The specific knowledge of what they are made of what they will do when the floor drops out, of who, in the event, they actually turn out to be. Rowan Hale had run for 18 months and had fought when fighting was what was needed and had kept her brother's records in the lining of her saddlebag like a responsibility she'd inherited and would not put down. She had not been brave in the way stories describe bravery, without fear, without cost, without the long nights of calculation about whether the next thing was survivable. She had been afraid most of the time. She had been uncertain. She had been wrong about some things and had adjusted. She had done it anyway. That is, when you strip the dramatics away, what courage actually consists of. Not the absence of fear, just the decision, made again and again and again, to keep moving in the right direction in spite of it. Gideon Vance had carried his father's loss like a debt he didn't know how to pay, and it had kept him static for 12 years. Working other men's land, refusing to want his own because wanting felt like exposure, like the setup for another signed deed and another man's death by degrees. He had walked into a storage room for a rifle and walked out with something harder and more necessary, and he had chosen, every day after that, not to turn around. People talk about healing and justice like they're final states, like there's a moment where the accounting is settled and the wound is closed and what was broken is fixed. It doesn't work like that, and anyone who's actually been through something difficult knows it doesn't work like that. The Blackthorn outfit was dismantled, and the men at the top of it were convicted, and the girls from the convoy went back to lives that would never be fully uncomplicated by what had happened to them. And Reed sent money to his daughter in Callaway every month from a town that was different from Mineral Fork. And Nate Frey kept looking for his sister in the ways that were available to him. And Clara Brent worked with 12 more girls over the following year through a network she built herself in the space where grief had been. And in a county 3 days west of Weston County, a fence line got built, a little at a time, in the direction of something that was not a wound and not a memorial, but just a life. Imperfect, contingent, genuinely uncertain about the future, and chosen. That's enough. It has to be enough because it's what there actually is. The land didn't care about any of it, which was fine. Land doesn't owe you a meaning. You make the meaning yourself, with your hands and your choices and the people you decide to stand beside, and then you set a fence post in the ground straight and tamp it down until it holds, and you move on to the next one. The creek ran. The ridge stood. The sky went dark and the stars came out cold and numerous and indifferent, which is what stars do. And the two people who had made their way here through all the country between then and now were inside out of the dark. and the fence ran east another 3 posts further than it had that morning. It was enough.